Hey guys, tonight we were going back, way back, to a time of marble columns, flowing togas, and some of the most whispered about after-parties in history. Yes, that kind of Roman party. The kind that makes modern bachelor weekends look like PTA meetings. We're diving into what ancient Roman sex parties were actually like. Warts, wine, and weird power dynamics included. And just a heads up, you probably won't survive this. Not just because of the social politics and bizarre customs, but because if you were born outside the Roman elite, you weren't even on the guest list. And if you were, well, you were about one bad joke away from losing your social standing, or your head. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. No pressure, just vibes. Also, drop your city and the time you're watching this. I always get a kick out of seeing who's listening to Roman debauchery at 2 AM. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're a few days into summer in Rome, real summer, where the marble burns and the street smells like olives and sweat. You're not poor, but you're not important. You've got enough money to wear decent sandals and not enough to avoid public baths. But tonight, your luck changes. A friend of a friend, you're still not sure how, slips you a folded wax tablet sealed in string. You crack it open. The script is loopy, perfumed. You've just been invited to a gathering at the Villa Petronia up on the Aventine Hill. Now, you've heard of Petronia. Everyone has, widowed twice, never remarried, famous for her poetry, her taste in peacocks, and her wildly inappropriate parties. Rumours include a musician getting tipped in pearls and a senator vomiting into a statue's mouth. But the real thrill isn't the chaos, it's being seen there. If you're on the list, you matter. If you're not, you're a nobody. And for one night, you matter. When you arrive, the gates don't swing, they unfold like someone designed them more for theatre than security. A guard, or maybe a very large statue, it's hard to tell, checks your name. You're ushered through a garden that smells like crushed mint and something faintly musky. 2 peacocks scream nearby, they are in fact real. Inside the atrium, everything is exaggerated. The marble floors reflect the flame of oil lamps. And statues of gods watch you from every angle. You see Venus, of course, half naked and smug. Bacchus, no surprise there, with his wine cup raised and eyes already glazed. Even Mercury's here, his winged feet stepping on someone's clothes. Which is weird because, oh, right, people are already half undressed. You're early. That was smart. You get him to scope out the scene before the real players arrive. You take a goblet of wine, probably Falernian, from the way the cowboy winces as he pours, and try not to look too eager. Across the room, a cluster of guests laugh too loudly. One of them is a poet, you think. He has ink on his fingers and no sandals. Another has rings on every toe. That's probably intentional. Now here's something most people forget. Not all Roman sex parties were wild right out of the gate. Most started with dinner, an hours-long, elbow-on-the-cushion kind of feast where courses arrived on silver trays and everyone tried not to spill sauce on their toga. You sit close to the fountain, under a ceiling painted like the night sky, and try not to be obvious about your nerves. The girl to your left is eating oysters with her fingers. She's wearing a sheer stola and a necklace made entirely of amber. She introduces herself as Clytemnestra. You doubt that's her real name. The man to your right is already halfway through his second wine dilution and insists you try a fig soaked in honey and pepper. It's good. Surprisingly good. Then again, you might be buzzed already. Historical sidebar before we drift further into this dream. There were sex parties in ancient Rome, but they weren't everyday affairs. They were status-flexing, risk-heavy, and not as common as we'd like to believe. Most were hosted by the elite, like Petronia, to gather influence or to make a statement. They weren't orgies from minute one. They started like this, structured, polite, and a little tense. Everyone watching everyone else, just enough plausible deniability. And here's your quirky fact for the night. Roman invitations sometimes included riddles. Not printed, of course, spoken. The guest would pass it along in secret, and if you solved it, you earned your spot. Tonight's party, no riddle. Which is both flattering and slightly unnerving. Now, as the food winds down, the music creeps in. Soft flute, then harp, then a low male voice singing in Greek. Somewhere in the villa, incense gets lit, and the scent of cinnamon and resin winds through the air. A servant passes by offering a bowl of warm oil. People start loosening their clothes. Not in a frantic way, but like it's part of the rhythm. You hear laughter that borders on moaning. Someone's sandals get thrown into a potted laurel. You're not sure when the shift happens, but it does. Petronia enters. Not dramatically, she just appears in the doorway, gold bangles stacked up her arm, hair pinned with pins shaped like birds. She nods at the room, smiles like a queen surveying a loyal court, and raises a glass. "Let's see who can still speak Greek by dawn," she purrs. And just like that, the rules of the night change. The air thickens as the first round of lamps is extinguished. Not all at once, but in soft, teasing intervals, each corner of the villa dimming like a sigh. The walls seem to flicker and melt in the wavering candlelight, and shadows begin to dance in ways that are both artistic and suggestive. You can't tell if it's the wine, the incense, or the fact that Petronia has just kicked off her sandals and walked barefoot into the centre of the room, but you feel like you're about to be pulled into something you're not entirely ready for, but definitely not about to leave. You stand and follow the slow migration from the triclinium, the dining room, into what might generously be called a lounging chamber. In reality, it's more of a performance space. Cushions spill onto mosaic floors, walls are painted with scenes of half-draped nymphs and overly confident satyrs, and overhead, an open oculus lets in the faint sound of cicadas. The villa is built for sound and echo, for scent and skin. The architecture knows its purpose, decadence disguised as leisure. This, you realise, is where the party truly begins. The room fills slowly, bodies flowing in like wine poured from an amphora. A poet begins reciting a passage from Ovid, something about desire and metamorphosis. You catch only pieces, distracted by a woman brushing her fingertips along the back of another's neck. Conversations break into murmurs, eyes meet, linger, then slide away again. No one here is exactly themselves anymore. The wine has taken root, so has the promise in the air. Petronia glides between her guests like a benevolent spider. She leans down to whisper something in the ear of a young soldier who turns the colour of cooked lobster. She pulls a cord from her waist, not to bind, but to drop it like a gauntlet. She's setting the tone now. The hosts always do. You overhear fragments as people pass. "He brought figs. That's real Egyptian linen. She's already on her third cup. Gossip and judgment live here too, make no mistake. These parties might masquerade as free-for-alls, but everyone's still calculating. Who's seen with whom? Who's bold enough to start something? Who's waiting to pounce?" Historical aside time, Roman villas, particularly those belonging to the elite, often had designated rooms for scandalous gatherings, some even purpose-built for sensory pleasure. You might know them as cubiculum, or more scandalously schwanacular, or upper-story private rooms. These weren't just bedrooms, they were entire atmospheres, built for performance, for heat, for mischief, and in rare cases, like this villa, entire wings were devoted to nothing but controlled indulgence. The Villa Petronia's reputation is not just built on rumour, it's structural. As the night slips deeper, musicians appear from alcoves. One plays a double aulos, the twin-reeded instrument producing a snaking, sinuous melody that wraps around your ribs. Another plucks a kithara, more for rhythm than melody. The beat is slow, sensual, and just slightly off-kilter, perfect for the mood. Someone lets out a laugh, not forced, but from the gut. Another hand brushes another thigh. You're no longer counting who touches whom. That kind of inventory went out the window with the second wine dilution. At your elbow, someone offers a small dish. You peer inside, boiled goose tongue, spiced with cumin. Odd, but you eat it. It's good, or maybe the alcohol is good. Maybe everything is just soft and round and too slow to object to. The fringe fact for this section? Some villas included secret passages behind the walls so that slaves and servants could move unseen, replenishing wine, cleaning up spilled oil, or replacing incense without disturbing the performance. In fact, you catch a flash of movement through a slit in the marble behind the musician. Someone's back there, always watching, always working. The party is for the guests, but the gears are being cranked from the shadows. Now here's where it gets interesting, because for all the stories, the orgy doesn't start like a trumpet blast. It starts with one person leaning in too close, with a servant bringing scented oil and no one stopping them when they start massaging it into bare shoulders. With a game, always a game. Tonight it's a kind of dare, whispered by a Petronia to the poet. Name a body part in Latin and kiss it on someone else. It's silly. It's meant to be. But it works. A young man kisses the arch of a woman's foot and says, "Plantaris." She giggles and dares him back. It becomes a chain reaction. Neck, shoulder, inner elbow. The room fills with soft laughter and the hush of shifting cushions. No one's fully naked yet, but modesty's been evaporating like dew onto a rooftop. And now the open, scholarly debate. Were these kinds of parties as common as we imagine? Or are we extrapolating too much from poets like Juvenal and historians with axes to grind? Some argue that Roman sex parties were the exception and not the rule, reserved for the ultra-elite or for specific religious or festival events. Others point out that sources like Petronius' Satyricon might be exaggerated satire, not documentary. But the artefacts, the wall paintings, and the private inscriptions suggest at least some truth in the tales. Not everyone in Rome was throwing bacchanalias, but some most definitely were. Back in the room, the kissing game devolves into a sort of affectionate sprawl. A couple slips behind a curtain. Another group gathers around the harpist, feeding him grapes as he plays blindfolded. Your seatmate, Clytemnestra, still definitely not her real name, leans into your shoulder and asks if you'd like to see the midnight garden. You say yes, obviously. You're led through a hall lit with floating lamps past a statue of Mars with lipstick on his helmet, and into an open courtyard where the grass is soft and the stone benches are warm from the day's heat. You hear laughter, you hear moaning, you see glimpses, a hand gripping marble, a back arching in torchlight, a robe discarded like yesterday's news. It's not chaos, it's not even vulgar, it's choreographed. That's the surprise. This isn't a free-for-all, it's a slow shared unravelling. You feel less like a voyeur and more like a musician, just joining in the harmony. And as the moonlight drips across the tiles, you realise this night isn't about climax. It's about permission, about the rare, glittering freedom to be seen, touched, chosen, or not. Because even here, in a room where everything's allowed, there are still choices, boundaries, power. And you're still navigating them. You don't remember at what point your sandals came off, but now you're barefoot, and the stone beneath you feels cool and grounding like a tiny secret only your feet know. The midnight garden, as Clytemnestra called it, is even stranger than you expected. Low hedges cut into spirals, small marble fountains gurgling like whispering mouths, and scattered torches flickering like they might get shy and blow themselves out. The scent out here is thick with crushed myrtle and something smokier, maybe frankincense, maybe burnt rosemary. It doesn't matter. It just smells old and deliberate, like everything was planted with a purpose you weren't meant to question. People drift between shadows like they've done this 100 times. And maybe they have. You're realising now that this isn't an isolated event. It's a ritual. These people know their roles. They are part of a choreography that predates you by generations. Petronia didn't invent this, she inherited it. And tonight she's passing it on. You sit near the edge of a marble fountain, watching as a group fans out on cushions arranged like petals. Someone plays dice, but the stakes aren't coin, they're favours. The man who loses is handed a strip of cloth and instructed to blindfold the next player. Another rolls and ends up massaging oil into someone's shoulders. No one is naked yet, but the clothes hang off bodies now like afterthoughts. You realise this isn't a striptease, it's the gradual collapse of performance. The guests are disrobing from status, not just fabric. Let's talk fashion, because yes, even at an orgy, Romans had rules. The default party look was a loosened toga for men, though in spaces like this, shorter tunics or even going bare-chested was acceptable. Women wore stolas or light chitons, often sheer or dyed with saffron to hint at heat and wealth. Jewellery was everywhere. Gold bangles, pierced nipples, rings on fingers and toes, and perfume, oh gods, the perfume. Every breeze smells like someone's signature scent. The Romans didn't believe in being subtle about it either. Scents were layered. Musk, rose, cinnamon, cedar, even nard from India. To them, smelling good was moral, not just sensual. It showed civilization, taste, and also that you had a bath slave. Quirky fact time, some parties included hired flavourers, basically human air fresheners who walked through the room trailing incense or carrying pomanders. Their whole job was to keep the atmosphere scented. Think living candles, but more judgmental. Now let's back up a second. You probably noticed that this party has very few togas left, but no one seems panicked. That's because Romans didn't treat nudity like we do. Nakedness wasn't automatically sexual, it was contextual. A nude statue in a bathhouse was art. A nude person reclining in a banquet after too many cups of wine, also art apparently, but, and here's the nuance, The rules around who could be naked and how are very clear, which brings us to tonight's underlying tension: status. As you recline on your elbow watching a patrician woman, maybe late 30s, rings heavy on every finger, feed dates to a younger man with soft shoulders and a servant's posture, you realise that everything happening here is shaped by invisible lines. That woman could seduce him, laugh at him, even tie him up with her sash if she liked. But if he, a slave or freedman, tried to take the lead, different story, scandalous, dangerous. The balance here is delicate. Consent is less about enthusiasm and more about hierarchy, and that's where it gets uncomfortable. Not everyone at this party is free. Not everyone has the same rights to say no. You see it in the quick glances of some of the oil servants, in the practiced stillness of the musicians. They're not guests. They're part of the ambience. Their pleasure is irrelevant. Their compliance is expected. It's not that these parties are only exploitative to some, but exploitation is threaded through them like gold through silk. One girl walks past holding a tray of figs, and she's not much older than 14. She keeps her eyes low, her shoulders squared. She's been trained to be invisible. You look away, guilt mixing with wine in your stomach. It won't be the last time tonight. Here's your historical fact. Roman society ran on slavery. That's not an embellishment. It's the foundation. In some households, slaves outnumbered free citizens. At parties like this, they served the wine, played the music, fanned the air, and yes, sometimes much more. In elite circles, it was expected. That expectation sat there like a stain no one tried to clean. Scholarly debate enters now. How much agency did enslaved people really have in these situations? Some records show that certain house slaves could gain influence, even affection. Others were trusted with high tasks, kept in luxurious surroundings, but many were trafficked, assaulted, discarded. There's no neat consensus, just fragments of lives half recorded in stone, in complaints, in poetry that danced around the truth. But for now, back to the party. Someone has produced a lyre and begun plucking a tune that sounds like the beginning of a storm. It's soft, insistent, rhythmic. A woman dances slowly, letting her sash fall and catching it with a twist of her ankle. She's not young, but she's magnetic. People shift to watch. Not openly gawking, just pretending to sip wine while tracking her hips. She doesn't speak, doesn't smile. She's the performance and the conductor. You're handed another cup. You're told it's spiced with cinnamon and mulled in the kitchen for hours. It tastes like fire and sweetness. You don't ask what's in it, but your skin feels lighter and your tongue feels looser. A man leans over and asks if you've ever been to Pompeii. He says it like it's a dirty word. You laugh. He takes your hand and draws a shape on your palm with his finger. It's not a letter. You don't ask, you follow. And this is how it works. You move from one moment to the next. You accept the wine. You watch the dance. You say yes or maybe or not yet. And everyone pretends like it's effortless. But you can feel the strain underneath. The performance of pleasure is exhausting. Some of the guests are already slipping away. Not everyone stays for the whole night. Some leave carefully to protect their names. Others leave because the buzz fades and the emptiness starts to show. But you're still here. Feet bare, lips sweet, caught somewhere between thrill and unease. The party hasn't turned wild yet. That's coming. But right now, you're learning the rules. And the most important one, you're always being watched. You wake up from whatever spell you're under with the distinct feeling that time is no longer working properly. Maybe it's the third or fourth cup of wine. Maybe it's the strange rhythm of the flute echoing from the peristyle. Or maybe it's the way everyone in this villa moves like they have been practicing choreography all their lives. Either way, you're beginning to realise that the actual feast was only foreplay. In Rome, indulgence starts at the table, but it never stays there. The food is the setup. What comes next is the real main course. By now, couches have been rearranged, cushions flung, and platters mostly cleared, except for one still heaped with grapes, dates, and oddly shaped cheeses. The dining room has slowly melted into something else. The torches burn lower, the conversations have turned into whispers, and several guests are already half sprawled across one another in a blur of limbs and laughter. If you're not careful, you might get swallowed up in it too, but you're still trying to observe, take mental notes, hold on to a thread of self-awareness like a lifeline. Let's rewind for a second. The Roman banquet, or convivium, wasn't just about gluttony. It was a sacred, almost ritualistic experience. Courses were timed, entertainment was carefully selected. The mixing of wine and water was practically an art form, and moderation, ironically, was something to brag about, even at the most debauched gatherings. But moderation in this context didn't mean restraint, it meant style. If you passed out under the table or vomited on your host's mosaic floor, you weren't scandalous, you were just embarrassing. Still, you did well, you kept pace, you nodded at the right jokes, you ate the eel with pomegranate glaze even though it looked like a coiled curse. Now, as your stomach settles into a warm, buttery haze, you understand that all that food had a purpose. This wasn't dinner, it was fuel. From the other side of the room, a servant appears with a tray of tiny glass vials. You're handed one, small, cloudy, warm from being nestled against someone's skin. You hold it up. Drink? You ask. The servant shakes his head. Rub, he whispers, then disappears. You uncap it. The smell is thick and spicy, a mix of cinnamon, myrrh, and something like crushed violet. You dab a bit on your wrists. Your skin feels warmer already. Whether it's placebo or not doesn't matter. It's working, which brings us to tonight's aphrodisiacs. The Romans were obsessed with them. Oysters, of course, were top tier. Their slippery texture and supposed Venusian energy made them a staple. Figs too, especially split open and drizzled with honey. Certain wines were steeped with herbs meant to stir desire. Rocket, a type of arugula. Pepper, even powdered beetroot. Some even used exotic roots from Africa or Asia. Things they couldn't pronounce but were told would awaken the loins. That's a direct quote from a very smug philosopher. But here's the weird fact. The Romans also believed wolf liver, consumed raw, and while the moon was waxing, could increase sexual stamina. No one at this party's offering that, thankfully, but you wouldn't be shocked if someone had it. There's always one. Back to the room. Petronia has returned, now without her earlier gold bangles. She's wearing less too, just a gauzy wrap that hangs more off than on her. She claps once and the music stops. Silence swells. It's time, she says, and no one needs to ask what she means. There's no dramatic orgy music or sudden pile of people on the floor like some cheap fresco. It begins like a wave, soft, slow, rising. One couple leans in to kiss. Another reclines, running fingers along a shoulder, down a chest. The lights dim again, somehow. You don't even see who does it. The villa itself seems to know when to turn the temperature up. And then, just when things start to dissolve into a haze, a voice cuts through. "Game time?" says someone near the dais. He's a nobleman by the look of his rings, but younger than most, with curly hair and a face too smug for someone so obviously drunk. He claps, and a bowl is brought forward. Inside scrolls. "Each of you draw one," he declares. "No looking. Fate will choose your pleasure." You exchange a glance with the person nearest you, Clytemnestra again, who's now draped like a feline across the couch, clearly thrilled. "What happens if I don't like what I draw?" you ask. She shrugs. "Then you drink. But if you do it, you might get something extra." She winks. You don't ask what extra means. When it's your turn, you pull a scroll, unroll it. "Kiss the person with the longest hair," it says. You look around. Easy enough. There's a man nearby with thick curls past his shoulders. You nod at him. He grins, leans in, and the kiss, well, it's warmer than expected. Not sloppy, not rushed, just long enough for you to forget where you are. Others draw stranger tasks. Someone has to recite a line of poetry before being kissed. Someone else is told to draw a figure in wine on someone's back. It's all suggestive, but nothing overt. Not yet. That's the genius of the Roman approach. Eroticism is layered, like peeling fruit with your teeth. Now, scholarly debate alert. Were these kinds of games actually common, or are we being seduced by the scandal-loving satirists of the time? Some scholars argue that while sexual banter and flirtation were part of Roman feasts, the more elaborate dares and scroll games were the invention of bored aristocrats, or literary devices used to satirize them. Others say that private gatherings like this one, especially in the late Republic and early Empire, were exactly the kind of place these rituals unfolded. The truth is, like always, murky. But if tonight's party is any indication, the elite definitely knew how to make games interesting. Someone nearby is now topless. Another has shed everything but a necklace. The oil from earlier is being passed around again, now slick on hands and skin. A couple to your right has disappeared behind a curtain. A few guests don't even bother with privacy. They're wrapped around each other like ivy on marble, slow, deliberate, and mostly silent. This isn't performative, it's indigent. For themselves, not for show. You take another sip of wine and feel it pool behind your eyes. You lean back and breathe. The scent of incense is heavier now, and the music returns, softer, with a rhythm like a heartbeat. You close your eyes just for a second. You're not sure whether you're drunk, aroused, overwhelmed, or maybe all three, but you are absolutely certain of one thing. You've stepped into a world with its own rules, its own gravity, and if you're not careful, you might start thinking it's normal. The music is different now, less structured, more fluid, like someone's composing it as they breathe. It swirls through the air alongside the rising heat, pulsing gently in time with soft gasps, laughter, and the ever-present rustle of shifting silk. Somewhere deep in the villa, water runs continuously, maybe a fountain or a small bath hidden in the architecture, and its sound provides a steady hush beneath the noise. You sit back, half reclining on a cushion that smells faintly of lavender and old wine, trying to keep your senses from completely melting. But it's not easy, not with how much you've eaten, not with how strong the last cup of wine was, and not with the way Clytemnestra just ran her fingers along your neck like she was tuning a stringed instrument. You're not alone, of course. All around you, the guests have slipped deeper into a collective trance, where touch is a language and eye contact means more than words. The curtain that divides feasting from flesh has fully dropped, and no one's pretending anymore. There are mouths on mouths, hands beneath fabric, limbs tangled like vines across the floor. Some couples drift into side rooms, private alcoves shrouded in gauze and candlelight. Others remain in the open, as if secrecy is no longer relevant. The villa feels alive, like it's inhaling with every moan and exhaling with every kiss. At some point, Petronia reappears, her hair down now, a long curl sticking to the sweat on her shoulder. She's not speaking, she doesn't need to. Her mere presence is the signal that we've reached another level. Someone is spreading rose petals across the tiles. Another guest is offering spoonfuls of honey to those brave or curious enough to take it off someone else's skin. You notice that people aren't drunk anymore, not really. There's a different kind of intoxication at work now, something ritualistic, which makes sense, because in Rome, sex wasn't just about bodies. It was about gods. Desire in all its forms was sacred. Venus, of course, ruled beauty, pleasure, and sexual love. But there were others, plenty of others. Bacchus, the god of wine and ecstasy, blurred the line between chaos and enlightenment. Even lesser-known deities like Priapus, the rustic fertility god with his absurdly oversized phallus, were invoked in moments like this. He may be a joke in mosaics, but his image also served as protection, against envy, against impotence, against dullness. Some Romans believed invoking him during pleasure could ward off bad luck. Others just liked the comedy. One of the guests, a lean man with a laurel crown made of actual laurel, begins to chant. It's not loud, but it carries. The words are Greek, old and cracked with age, something about nymphs. A few guests kneel, not reverently, but playfully. They offer fruits to an altar set in the corner of the room. A small marble statue of Venus slick with oil and flower petals. Someone kisses its feet. Someone else balances a fig between their lips, offering it to whoever dares claim it. You wonder, for a moment, if you're part of a ritual or just watching one unfold. It's not clear anymore. Here's your historical fact of the night. Roman religion wasn't just about temples and oracles. It was baked into every aspect of life, including sex. Certain festivals, like the Floralia, honoured fertility with games, nudity and public performances that sometimes dipped into the erotic. The cult of Bacchus, or Dionysus, if you're going Greek, was infamous for ecstatic rites that blurred the line between celebration and frenzy. At their height, these rites were seen as so subversive that the Roman Senate cracked down hard in 86 BCE, fearing they could undermine state authority. But the allure never quite died. Quirky fact, there was a Roman goddess named Libidina, literally lust. She didn't get a major temple, but she had her followers. Some Romans wore phallic amulets as protection, not just from evil spirits, but from bad sex. Priorities. Tonight, the gods are everywhere. Not in the booming theatrical way, but subtly, like incense clinging to your clothes. People make offerings with their bodies, not coins. You see a woman arch her back like an altar. Two men kneeling at her sides, kissing her thighs in sync. Another guest pours wine down someone's chest and laps it up, leaving purple streaks across bare skin. You look away. Then you look back. Now here's where it gets interesting and slightly debated. Scholars have argued for decades about just how religious these parties really were. Some say the gods were invoked only for flavour, to add a touch of legitimacy to what was essentially upper-class escapism. Others insist that for many Romans, especially in the more mystical sects, sex was genuinely seen as a form of communion, a bridge to the divine. Who's right? Probably both. Like everything Roman, the line between sacred and profane wasn't a line at all. It was a loop. As the night thickens, so does the haze. You feel detached from your body like you're floating just above it. Everything slows. You see someone dance again. Maybe the same woman from before, maybe not. Her feet are bare, stained with crushed petals. She dances not to entertain, but as if she's casting a spell. A few guests follow her, mimicking her movements. You watch a man draw invisible symbols on a woman's back with his fingertip. When she turns, she smiles like she knows a secret you don't. There's a new drink being passed around and now thicker, almost like syrup. You take a sip. It tastes like cinnamon, clove, and something bitter underneath. Your mouth tingles. Clytemnestra warns you not to have too much. It keeps you awake, she says, but not in your head. You believe her. Someone begins to sing, off-key but haunting. A chant maybe, or a lullaby. Others hum along, and soon the entire room vibrates with this low melodic murmur. It's not loud, but it's everywhere. The walls, the floors, your bones, it all pulses in time. You realise, somewhere deep in the murmur, that this party is no longer just a social event. It's an atmosphere, a living, breathing thing. You're not observing anymore, you're part of it. Whether or not you do anything, you're in it. The gods have been invited, the wine has been poured. The games are in motion. There's no turning back to polite conversation now. And the strangest part? You don't want to. At some point, long after you've stopped keeping track of time or your place in the villa, the air becomes charged with something almost electric. The heat of bodies, the soft scrape of fabric against skin, and the slow, seductive rhythm of flutes have woven into a single pulsating presence. The garden has emptied a little. Some have peeled off into side rooms or vanished entirely, leaving only the soft echo of laughter behind. But in the main chamber, the heartbeat of the night continues. You find yourself leaning back against the cool edge of a marble bench, trying to distinguish reality from whatever this fever dream has become. A couple nearby is tangled together under a sheer netting, more suggestion than cover. Their silhouettes are faint, rippling gently as they move, as though even the air doesn't want to interrupt them. Across the room, a group has begun painting on one another. Yes, literally. One woman dips her fingers in a shallow bowl of crushed berries and begins tracing designs on her partner's back. They both giggle like children, which is strangely disarming in the middle of a scene that could easily be mistaken for divine worship. You sip your wine again and it's gone lukewarm, but you barely notice. You're too busy watching a man in a lionskin cloak tell a story that makes everyone around him burst into breathless laughter. Let's talk voyeurism, not just what's happening tonight, but the culture behind it. In Roman society, watching was often half the point. Even in the grand baths of the city, modesty was less about privacy and more about timing. You bathed with others, you sweated beside them in the caldarium, you maybe exchanged a flirtation, maybe more. And if someone watched, well, that was their blessing or curse. The human body wasn't treated as something shameful, but something to be sculpted, adorned, displayed. This party, wild as it may seem, fits that philosophy perfectly. Nothing here is hidden, not really. There are curtains and gauze and shadows, sure, but they're suggestions, not barriers. What you notice next is the way people pretend not to look. It's a game. Across the room, two men are wrapped together, one whispering into the other's ear while gently biting his shoulder. They are clearly being watched by half the room, including a trio of older guests pretending to examine a mural on the wall. Everyone plays innocent. No one actually is. Here's your historical fact of the evening. Voyeurism wasn't just tolerated in ancient Rome, it was institutionalized in some ways. Amphitheatres didn't just showcase violence, but often included ludi, games or events with erotic components. Especially during certain festivals. Theatrical plays sometimes involved nudity. Even religious ceremonies occasionally dipped into the sensual, blurring the lines between sacred ritual and spectacle. Romans liked to watch, and when the upper classes got together in private, they leaned into it even harder. But here's your fringe detail. Among the weirder Roman habits was the practice of having bedroom murals featuring erotic scenes, not just in brothels but in private homes. Frescoes showed threesomes, acrobatics, positions that made you question the flexibility of the human spine. And these weren't hidden away. They were in guest rooms. Imagine staying at someone's house, and the guest bed is beneath a painting of a goddess getting quite personal with two satyrs. That was the vibe. Back at the party, you shift your position on the bench and realise someone has joined you. He's older, probably in his 50s, wearing nothing but a chain around his neck and an amused smirk. "First time?" he asks. His voice is rich, slightly slurred, but his eyes are sharp. You nod. "I thought so," he says. "You're still blinking too much." You raise a brow, unsure if it's a compliment or a warning. "Don't worry," he continues, sipping his wine. "We all start that way. It's like watching someone wake up from a very boring dream." He clinks his cup against yours. "Welcome to Rome." Then, just as casually as he arrived, he gets up and walks away, trailing a scent of myrrh and cedar. There's a sudden burst of laughter from the far end of the room. Someone's playing a version of Truth or Dare, except here it's called Outnager, Outfack. Either deny or do. A woman with thick curls and a voice like honey dares a man to recite a love poem while balanced on one leg. He fails, of course, and ends up stripped of his tunic and covered in kisses by the time he falls over. The game continues. No one's keeping score. The whole point is the surrender. A few cushions over, a couple appears to be locked in a staring contest. Noses almost touching, hands not quite touching each other. They don't speak. It's mesmerising, like they've turned attraction into an art form. Not everything is about the final act, you realise. Sometimes the tease is the reward. Let's pause for the scholarly debate because it's an important one. Did Romans actually see these events as romantic? Or was it all politics, status, performance? The truth is murky. Roman love, especially among the elite, was rarely about emotion the way we imagine it today. Marriage was a tool, affairs were statements, lust was power, and pleasure was political. But the poets, oh the poets, muddy the waters. Ovid, Catullus, Propertius, they wrote with the agony of real yearning, of jealousy and heartbreak and tender obsession. Were they exaggerating? Maybe, or maybe underneath the politics and power. Romans craved connection just like the rest of us. Back in the villa, the energy shifts again. Softer now, slower. The initial wave of heat and hunger has settled into something almost tender. You see more lounging, more quiet touch. Some guests are asleep, curled beside each other like cats. A woman lies back with a peeled grape between her lips, eyes closed, content. Someone braids another's hair. A harpist plays in the corner, the notes falling like dew. One final servant glides through the room, leaving behind tiny bowls of water, fresh figs, and a few warm cloths. Cleanup has begun, subtly, without pushing anyone out. The party doesn't end. It recedes. Clytemnestra finds you again, her hair loose now, streaked with glitter from someone else's chest. She looks at you like she's seen the entire night unfold behind your eyes. "You did well," she says, pressing a fig into your hand. Most don't make it past the first cup without trying to take their clothes off or their status too seriously. You smile, unsure what that means, but you take the fig. Because here, indulgence isn't about abandon, it's about endurance. And you're still here. There's a strange quiet now, not silence exactly. There are still murmurs, the clink of bronze cups being set down, the soft coo of someone dozing into a lover's lap. But a hush has settled over the villa like the last breath before dawn. You're not sure what time it is. The moon has shifted overhead, casting long fingers of silver light through the oculus above, catching the curve of a shoulder here, the shine of oil on a hip there. It no longer feels like a party. It feels like something ancient, older than wine, older than Rome even. Like the human need for closeness has collapsed space and time and brought everyone here together into the same moment of breathless, wordless understanding. And that's when you start to notice the lines again. Not on people's bodies. Those have long been discarded, blurred, enjoyed. But the social ones. Invisible and unspoken, but undeniably present. You're watching a man, young, flushed, clearly drunk, maybe even drugged, reach toward a noblewoman whose hair still gleams with gold thread. He touches her thigh, gently, respectfully, and she slaps his hand away without even looking at him. No scene, no outrage, just the reality of the thing. He reached beyond his rank. You've felt it too, in subtler ways. The way some guests are offered the finer wines while others are handed clay cups. The way the servants, still hovering, silent, alert, kneel more deeply when pouring for certain guests. The way Petronia moves through the room like a queen in exile, all power and ease, while others seem to orbit her without ever really approaching. Even naked, Datus clings like a second skin. Here's your historical truth bomb. In Rome, your social rank wasn't just your resume. It was your moral compass, your bedroom permission slip, your ticket to indulge, or your leash to stay leashed. Freeborn citizens had more rights than freedmen. Freedmen had more rights than slaves. Women, depending on their family's status, could wield terrifying power, or none at all. Even at a party like this, where everything seems wild and untamed, those rules hang in the air like incense. Everyone knows who's allowed to touch whom. Everyone knows what line not to cross, and yet they get crossed all the time. Take the story of the Emperor Claudius's third wife, Messalina, one of Rome's most infamous social climbers and sexual tacticians. According to scandalous accounts, and yes, most of them were likely exaggerated, she once entered a public brothel under a pseudonym and challenged the other prostitutes to a contest, who could take the most clients in a single night. Supposedly she won, but whether or not it's true doesn't matter. The fact that the story spread reveals something crucial. When someone broke the rules, it wasn't the act that caused outrage, it was who did it. You see that play out again tonight. A young servant, barefoot, beautiful, with the wide, frightened eyes, is drawn into a group by a woman wearing only rings and perfume. The group laughs. Someone beckons him closer. He hesitates, then obeys. No one stops him. No one asks if he wants to be there. His body is assumed to be part of the decor. Quirky fact, while the Romans valued social order, they also adored scandal. The more forbidden the act, the more delicious the gossip. In elite circles, seducing someone beneath your station wasn't shocking, it was predictable. But being caught? That was the real transgression. It wasn't about morals, it was about reputation. And yet there were always whispers of something else, of connection, even in the shadows. You've seen it tonight too. One man, silver-haired and clearly noble, has been seated with the same servant boy all night, not touching, not demanding, just talking, quietly, like equals. And every now and then, they laugh in the same way, in the same rhythm, and you realise, not every moment here is performance. This is where the scholarly debates get juicy. Some historians argue that Roman sex parties were power displays, full stop, extensions of the same systems that controlled politics, marriage, and inheritance. Others argue for complexity, that within those systems real emotions bloomed. That maybe desire didn't always care about status, that love, messy, unbalanced, inconvenient love, found its way into even the most orchestrated of encounters. Back in the villa, Petronia leans against a pillar, sipping from a wide goblet, watching the room with the serenity of a goddess who knows she's already been worshipped enough. She catches your eye, smiles, lifts her glass, and in that moment you wonder how many secrets she knows, how many alliances were formed tonight under her roof, how many rivals flirted with each other out of boredom or spite or something more dangerous. You wonder how much power is being traded here, not with coins, but with glances and invitations and the slow, careful promise of future favours. Because here's what no one tells you about these parties. They're not just about pleasure, they're about access. About who you can stand beside without flinching. About who sees you in this space and remembers you outside of it. There's a quiet war under the moaning and music. A game of influence played by people who know how to make surrender look strategic. Someone beside you, a woman with bronze skin and a laugh like cracked glass, leans in and whispers, "He's going to owe her after this." You glance at who she means, a senator half drunk draped across a pillow with a girl on each arm and an ambassador watching carefully from across the room. You nod. You get it. Alliances are being made tonight, but not through conversation, through complicity. Which leads us to the weirdest realization of the evening. Even in a room full of naked bodies and shared pleasures, some people are still lonely. You see it in the man at the edge of the room who hasn't spoken in over an hour. In the woman who laughs too loudly and looks over her shoulder too often. In the servant who wipes spilled wine from a cushion with a practiced grace and dead eyes. You lie back, staring up at the painted ceiling. There's a depiction of Venus riding a dolphin, holding a mirror to her own reflection. Around her, tiny cherubs scatter petals that never fall. It's beautiful and absurd and kind of perfect. Because that's what this night is, a mirror. You came here expecting excess, decadence, history, you found all that. But what you didn't expect was to be seen, or to see others so clearly. And now, as the edges of the night begin to fray and reality begins to reclaim you, you wonder what happens after all this. When the clothes are back on, when the oil is washed away, when everyone steps back into their public masks and pretends none of it happened. But for now, that's tomorrow's concern. Tonight the hierarchy still holds, but so does the wine. And the stories being written here in sweat and whispers are the ones no historian ever gets quite right. You lose track of how long you've been sitting there, wrapped in fading heat, half drunk, your skin sticky with oil and smoke and someone else's perfume. The air is heavy with aftermath. Bodies lie draped across one another in a lazy sprawl of pleasure and exhaustion. But not everyone looks satisfied. Not everyone here came for the same reasons. You're starting to notice the silences now, the strange, hollow places between sighs and laughter. The looks that linger too long. The servants still moving through the shadows like ghosts. And that's when it really hits you. This whole event is built on a structure. Not marble and brick, but people. People without choices. People who didn't get an invitation. The slaves. From the moment you walk through the gate, there were more of them than you ever realized. Lighting the lamps, pouring the wine, wiping down the cushions, even adjusting the angle of a guest's recline. Always present, never acknowledged. Now, as the night begins to contract in on itself, their faces start to register. You start to see them not just as background, but as the silent machinery keeping the whole fantasy alive. There's a girl, young, small, with her hair tied back in a frayed ribbon, gathering abandoned cups. Her bare feet make no sound on the tiles. She doesn't look anyone in the eye, not out of deference but habit. She's been trained into invisibility. Her job is to be present without existing. Nearby, an older man kneels to mop up a spill of wine. His tunic is stained, his hands cracked and calloused. A group of drunken nobles laugh as they toss more grape skins onto the floor, just out of his reach. You see his mouth tighten, but he doesn't say a word. He just keeps wiping. Historical fact time. Rome's economy was fundamentally reliant on slavery, not just for labour in fields and workshops, but in domestic space, private villas, even the most intimate social functions. There were different categories of slaves. Household slaves, familia urbana, field slaves, familia rustica, public slaves owned by the state. Some were educated tutors, secretaries or doctors. Others were cooks, launderers, body servants or sexual attendants. And their fates varied wildly. Some gained trust, even manumission. Others died in silence, their names never recorded. Here, at a party like this, they play all roles except one. They are never guests. No matter how intimate their duties, no matter how many secrets they keep, their presence is always expected to be neutral. It's a contradiction as old as empire. You're close enough to touch but not to speak. You watch as a young boy, maybe 15, maybe younger, gets called over by a guest slouched half-naked on a cushion. The boy kneels. The guest gestures toward his wine cup. Then, without warning, he grabs the boy by the chin, turns his face left and right, examining him like fruit at market. No one stops him. No one even blinks. The boy's face doesn't change. He's mastered the art of emotional blankness. You hate how well he performs it. The uncomfortable truth, and here's your fringe fact, is that some Roman elites kept what were known as pueri delicati, delicate boys trained and raised specifically for beauty and obedience, often sexualized from a young age. They were chosen for their appearance and docility, and were treated as luxury objects, not people. These children weren't always purchased. Sometimes they were taken from conquered territories, presented as gifts or born into slavery. Their entire existence was shaped by someone else's desire. The idea of consent here, it doesn't exist, not in the way you know it. A slave couldn't legally refuse anything. They couldn't own their bodies, let alone protect them. At parties like this, where the atmosphere encourages indulgence, the line between pleasure and coercion doesn't blur, it disappears entirely. Scholars have argued about this for centuries. Some claim that within certain households, slaves formed close, even familial, relationships with their masters. That kindness existed, that favoritism could mean protection. Others counter that any affection within such a violently unequal system is inherently compromised, that even the illusion of choice was just another form of control. You can't help but agree with the latter, especially now watching a servant carry a half-conscious guest to a quieter room, eyes lowered the whole time. He doesn't complain. He doesn't pause, he's done this before many, many times. And you start to realise this villa, for all its beauty, runs on quiet cruelty. Not always loud, not always intentional, but ever present. A well-oiled machine fueled by flesh and silence. You're not guiltless. You drank the wine, you played the games. You let yourself be swept up in the sensuality of it all. But now you feel the edge of it, the cost. Because this wasn't a dream. It wasn't just erotic theatre. It was labour. It was controlled. It was survival. Some choosing it, many not. You look back at the girl collecting cups. She's near the doorway now, balancing a stack of trays, and for just a moment her eyes flicker up. They meet yours. It's only a second, but it lingers. There's no anger in her look, no shame, just weariness. Like she's seen 1,000 versions of you walk in here and try to decide if you're one of the good ones. You look away first. Clytemnestra reappears at your side. She's draped in someone else's robe now, laughing softly as she settles next to you. "You're quiet," she says. "Too much wine?" You nod. It's easier than explaining what you're feeling. She offers you a date from a dish and leans her head on your shoulder like nothing's changed. But everything has. There's a part of this party that no one sings about in poems. No fresco captures in technicolor detail. It lives in the gaps, the flicker of fear in a servant's eyes, the stiffness in a boy's shoulders as he's touched, the invisible wall between guest and ghost. Pleasure in Rome, you now understand, always came at someone else's cost. And that realization? It won't leave with the sunrise. You don't know when you started shivering, but the cool air feels like a ghost now, brushing against your bare arms, lifting the edges of fabric still clinging to your skin. It isn't cold, not really. It's that afterburn sensation, like your body has realized it should have said no long after it already said yes. The spell is cracking. The villa no longer glows with the same golden haze. It's dimmer, quieter, like someone has turned down the volume and left the frame hanging just a little crooked. The guests who remain are quieter too. The laughter is forced now, brittle around the edges. The wine tastes sour. The stories are slurred and a little too loud. And you begin to see a different kind of truth in all of this. Not everyone came here to enjoy themselves. Some came out of obligation, some to impress, some to escape. And others were simply trying to survive the night. You shift on the cushions, your back aching in a way that has nothing to do with posture. Across the room, a woman reclines with her eyes closed, lips parted in a way that might look sensual to someone less observant. But you can tell she's checked out. Her fingers lie limp against the goblet resting on her belly. Every few seconds, a man beside her strokes her thigh and whispers something into her ear, but she doesn't respond. She's still breathing but barely present. It's all performance. A pose held just long enough to not offend. Another man nearby is laughing with two companions, but his eyes flick toward the exits every few seconds, like he's calculating the earliest possible moment to slip away without insulting his host. He laughs too hard, he drains his cup too quickly, and when someone puts a hand on his back, he flinches, not visibly, but enough for anyone watching closely. You're watching closely now, you start to realise that this party, like many in Rome's elite circles, wasn't just a night of pleasure. It was a test, a social crucible wrapped in satin. Everything here, every joke, every gesture, every glance is being noted, filed away, weaponized. Not all at once, but later, tomorrow, next month, when alliances shift and favours are owed and someone needs a little reminder of how they behaved in Petronia's villa. Which brings us to your historical fact. Reputation in Roman society was currency. It could be spent, hoarded, shattered or traded, but never fully controlled. One wrong move at a banquet could follow a person for years, a misjudged affair, a joke made in poor taste, a whispered confession overheard by the wrong person. The Romans even had a word for scandalous talk, infamia, and if enough of it stuck to your name, no wealth or lineage could protect you from the fallout. Careers were destroyed not by crimes but by rumours, and yet paradoxically, Romans also loved a good scandal. They adored gossip like it was a sport. In elite gatherings like this, there was an unspoken agreement. Indulge, but don't overplay your hand. Be daring, but not desperate. Be available, but never too available. And if you failed to walk that razor's edge, well, you could wake up the next day famous, or utterly ruined. Take the case of Marcus Caelius Rufus, a dashing orator and serial partygoer who found himself accused of everything from bribery to poisoning. Most of his political drama was wrapped up in his relationship with Clodia, a sharp-tongued aristocrat who may or may not have tried to frame him for murder after their affair went south. The actual facts are lost, but the damage wasn't. He was never quite taken seriously again. People still invited him, but mostly for entertainment. You look around now and wonder how many here are Marcus Caelius types, flirting with disaster because they don't know how to stop, or because it's the only time they feel seen. Here's your fringe fact for this part. There were actual etiquette manuals circulating among Rome's elite, like handwritten BuzzFeed listicles for surviving social events. Some advised how to compliment a host without sounding insincere, others warned against reclining too closely to someone of higher rank unless invited. And more than one included reminders not to get too emotional, too familiar, or too ambitious. Control was sexy. Desperation? Not so much. But the truth is, not everyone here has the luxury of control. You notice it in the way some guests try too hard. The man who keeps adjusting his robe, as if hiding a stain. The young woman who keeps checking the faces around her, searching for a sign that she still belongs. The freedman trying to laugh along with his old master, though his eyes betray that he knows he's laughing at his own expense. And then there are those who came with agendas. You catch the tail end of a whispered negotiation in the hallway. Land, influence, marriage arrangements cloaked in seductive smiles. The bedrooms are quiet now, but the real deals are just beginning. Every touch, every pairing, it's all leverage. Petronia has always known this. That's why her parties matter. They're where power meets flesh, and the consequences arrive in silence, wrapped in silk. You feel a hand on your back, not soft, intentional. It's a man you haven't seen before. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a beard like the ones carved into marble generals. His robe is impeccably arranged. His smile isn't warm. He leans in close, too close. "You've made quite the impression tonight," he says. You murmur something non-committal, but his hand doesn't move. Petronia speaks highly of you. A compliment? A threat? A proposition? You laugh, and it's the wrong kind of laugh, too uncertain. His smile widens, just a hair. Then he's gone, just like that, off to the next potential deal. But the weight of his hand lingers. You sit still for a long time after that, unsure of whether to feel flattered or hunted. And that's the Roman way, isn't it? Even desire comes with consequences. No one here is simply wanted. They're measured, weighed, plotted. Seduction is a strategy. Even surrender is calculated. You glance at the sleeping guests, the murmuring politicians, the servants still sweeping up petals and spilled honey. The villa breathes around you, opulent, ancient, and deeply bold, unapologetically human. But beneath all the beauty and brilliance and debauchery, you've begun to see it for what it is. This wasn't a night of freedom. It was a performance of survival. Dawn isn't quite here yet, but you can feel it creeping. The air has cooled into something gentler, less perfumed. Somewhere beyond the thick walls of the villa, the birds are waking up. Their distant chirping is almost jarring, like the real world is calling from the other side of the curtain. You rub your eyes, not from sleep, but from that strange kind of emotional hangover that only comes when a place insists on being both paradise and prison in the same breath. Around you, the night is thinning, like the gods have gathered their robes and quietly slipped out before anyone notices. There's a shift in the atmosphere now, like the house is exhaling. A few guests have vanished entirely. No goodbye, no footprints, just silence where they once were. Others lie entangled in the same cushions where they laughed hours ago, now snoring or murmuring in their sleep. A young man with golden cuffs is curled up like a child at the foot of a statue of Bacchus, his face sticky with wine and smeared lipstick. You don't know whose. And then there's the poetry. Not metaphorical, actual spoken-out-loud poetry. From somewhere in the back of the atrium, a thin nasal voice begins to recite lines of love and loss in perfect meter. The words drift into the open air like incense, melancholy and slow, a kind of closing credit for the night. You can't see the speaker, but the voice is familiar. One of the party's earlier musicians, maybe. Or a poet whose invitation doubled as a payment, one performance in exchange for entry. The verses are bittersweet, drawn from Ovid's Amores, if your sleep-deprived brain is right. All about a lover who disappears before morning, leaving nothing but a warm indent in the bed. It fits too well. Someone laughs too loudly, someone else tells them to shut up. A bottle topples, the poetry continues. Let's talk about the role of the arts in parties like this. For the Romans, beauty wasn't an accessory to pleasure. it was the scaffolding. A night like this wasn't complete without some combination of music, poetry, or storytelling. Whether bawdy or sublime, the arts elevated the entire experience. Romans believed that love, lust, and language all came from the same divine spark, and there was no greater thrill than indulging all three at once. Historical fact, elite Roman dinner parties often featured live readings, especially during the empire's golden literary age. Poets were invited to perform, sometimes dramatically, sometimes sarcastically, and their verses could elevate or destroy reputations. Patronage was everything. Say the wrong thing in your poem, you might not get invited back. Say the right thing, you might get a patron with a summer villa and too much wine. But here's your quirky fact. There were erotic dice games the Romans loved to play during parties. Literal ivory dice engraved with instructions like kiss the neck or strip or touch the thigh. Some even used a spinning wheel, a proto-Roman version of spin the amphora, where fate determined which body part received affection and which guest delivered it. Games like this weren't necessarily obscene, they were theatrical. They let people flirt without risk, or pretend it was all a joke when it wasn't. And that brings us back to the poetry, because what's being read now is no joke. The voice trembles a little on the last few lines. You catch one about the fragrance she left on my fingers. That line stays with you. You're still thinking about it when Clytemnestra stirs beside you, stretching like a cat, arms above her head, the silk wrap slipping off one shoulder. Still here? She whispers. Voice scratchy from too much wine and too many moans. I guess, you say. You didn't vanish with the others. Didn't know I could, and she smiles lazy, eyes still half closed. You learn, or you disappear. That feels like more than a metaphor. You glance around. Some of the guests who remain look shell-shocked, silent, wide-eyed, blinking into space like they've just come back from war or astral projection. Others are already pulling themselves together, tightening robes, repinning their hair, slipping jewellery back on like armour. There's a kind of ritual to it, the way they gather themselves piece by piece, readying for re-entry into a world where this night will be both memory and secret. You spot a servant clearing away the last of the trays. He's got dark circles under his eyes, and he moves with practiced exhaustion. As he bends to pick up a plate, a guest reaches out and slaps his backside like a joke. He doesn't flinch. He doesn't even blink. He's miles away, somewhere inside himself, cleaning up a party that he was never allowed to enjoy. And here's where the scholarly debate kicks in. Were these events empowering for anyone? Were they ever actually freeing? Some historians argue that the permissiveness of Roman parties, especially among the elite, created rare moments of liberation, where people could express desire outside of rigid social norms. Others argue the exact opposite, that these gatherings were just repackaged hierarchies, places where the same power structures played out with fewer clothes. You're starting to believe it's both, that freedom was always a luxury, granted to a few, felt by even fewer. The rest, they played along or didn't, and paid the price either way. Petronia re-enters the room at last, her presence like a curtain call. She's dressed again, sort of, though the everything she wears seems intentional and symbolic. Rich purple wrap, a gold clasp at her shoulder, her hair coiled like a crown. She walks barefoot across the marble floor, surveying the damage. Her gaze flicks across the cushions, the spilled wine, the half-dressed guests, and lands briefly on you. You survived, she says, amused. Barely, you reply. That's how you know it was good. She says it like a joke, but her tone is flat. Behind her smile there's something else. Fatigue, maybe? Or detachment. Like even she, the grand orchestrator, is not entirely untouched by the night's weight. Drink some water, she says over her shoulder, already moving on. You'll need it. And so you do. You take a cup from a passing tray and sip. The coolness is shocking, clean, real. You swallow hard, Minton. The poet finishes his final verse. A soft, dry applause ripples through the room. Some guests rise, others slump deeper into sleep. The magic has faded. The costumes are going back on, literally and figuratively. This is the part no one writes about. The clean-up, the reckoning. But you're here for it. Because tonight wasn't just indulgence. It wasn't just the wine or the laughter or the games. It was an excavation of power, of longing, of the strange human need to be seen, to touch, to perform, to pretend. And now, as the sun waits just beyond the horizon, your skin cooling, your pulse slowing, Your mind finally clearing, you realise you didn't come here for pleasure. You came here to understand it, and now you do. There's something almost sacred about the walk through the villa in the earliest hours, after the music has stopped and the laughter has died down. You step lightly over wine stains, scattered fruit, and the remnants of a feast that feels days old instead of hours. The lamps are flickering out one by one, like little gods retiring after granting too many wishes. You're not alone. Other guests are stirring now, stretching stiff limbs, quietly gathering robes and dignity like soldiers after a long, strange battle. There's no ceremony to it, no farewell toast, just soft sandals on marble and the occasional, "Did I say that out loud last night?" kind of look. You're not sure where you're headed. Somewhere between the inner courtyard and the outer garden, you just start following the faint breeze, the one that smells like olive trees and damp earth, not sweat and incense. And then you hear it. A rustle of fabric, a soft gasp, a low laugh. You pause behind a carved pillar and peek around, expecting maybe 2 guests finishing what they started hours ago. But what you see is different. 3 people, 2 women and a man, are standing in front of a mirror. The man who had strutted like a peacock earlier now looks nervous. He's fully nude, not uncommon at this point, but it's not about arousal anymore. He's watching his reflection as one of the women applies kohl around his eyes and ties a crimson sash around his waist, gently adjusting his posture. The other woman holds up earrings. There's laughter, sure, but it's gentle, encouraging. The man lifts his chin, exhales, and when he meets his own gaze in the mirror, something shifts. He smiles, not the smug, performative kind from earlier, but something closer to relief. This, it seems, is where the real fun begins. Let's talk about Roman gender expression, because this moment, 3 people reshaping identity for pleasure or performance, fits right into a rich, complicated, often misrepresented piece of Roman life. While Roman society had very rigid public expectations about masculinity, femininity and behaviour, the private sphere, especially during these elite indulgences, was far less predictable. What someone did in their domus, behind closed curtains, especially during a feast, could be completely at odds with how they presented themselves in the forum. The concept of fixed gender roles in Rome? That's a lie we inherited from the marble statues, not the messy humans who commissioned them. In elite circles, cross-dressing during festivals, roleplay and elaborate masquerades were not only tolerated, but sometimes celebrated. During Saturnalia, the famous midwinter festival, social roles were deliberately reversed. Slaves dined like masters, men wore women's clothes, and the usual order collapsed in the name of temporary, chaotic equality. But that chaos wasn't always confined to festivals, parties like the one you're at, where pleasure is the priority and shame is politely left at the gates, often blurred all kinds of lines, gender, class, age, even species if you believe the graffiti. You probably shouldn't. Here's your quirky fringe fact. The Emperor Elagabalus, one of the most infamous and misunderstood figures in Roman history, was said to have worn makeup, wigs and women's clothes in cats in public, and even requested to be addressed as a woman. Some sources claim he offered enormous sums of money to any physician who could perform sex reassignment surgery, a detail debated heavily, but nonetheless remarkable for a 3rd century account. Now, scholarly debate time. Were these acts truly expressions of gender variance, or were they simply viewed as entertainment? Some academics argue that cross-dressing and gender fluidity in Roman times were used to titillate or shock, rather than to reflect a deeper identity. Others point to figures like Elagabalus or various priests of Cybele, who dressed and lived as women, as evidence of early non-binary or trans identities, albeit framed through the spiritual and cultural context of the time. Back in the mirror room, the transformation is complete. The man now stands straighter, turns slowly to show off his silhouette, and the women cheer softly. They call him Julia now, and Julia beams. You walk away quietly, not wanting to intrude. But something about that scene sticks with you. Not the glamour of it, or the softness, or even the androgyny. It's the freedom, the quiet courage of choosing how to be seen, even just for a few hours, and having someone else say, yes, exactly, that's you. It makes you wonder what masks everyone else is still wearing. Not the literal ones, the sheer veils, the gold-threaded hoods, the decorative collars, but the deeper ones. The rigid identities they drag around in daylight. Senator, matron, slave, virgin, soldier. Mask shaped by law and expectation. masks they can only peel off in secret in spaces like this. You find yourself back in the central courtyard now, where the torchlight is low and a few guests are still whispering in clusters. Some are sitting in the pool with their feet dangling in the water. Others have already begun plotting their departure. Soft arrangements with their drivers, silent exchanges of jewellery mistakenly left behind. Clytemnestra appears at your side again, like she's summoned herself whenever your brain gets too serious. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she says, then pops a grape in her mouth without waiting for a reply. "Just watching," you say. "You do that a lot." "Maybe too much." She shrugs. "Maybe not enough." She wraps an arm around your waist, not seductively this time, just companionably, and leans her head on your shoulder. "You want to know the trick to surviving these nights?" she asks, her voice low. "It's not about keeping your robe on or getting invited back or even avoiding the poison wine." You wait. It's knowing who you are when the mirror's in your hand, not when they hold it up to you. That one sits heavy. You realise now how many people tonight didn't recognise their own reflections. How many hoped someone else would hand them an identity just for the night, and how many still wouldn't know what to do with it. You don't say anything, but you hold her a little tighter. Because even here, among velvet and marble and every indulgence imaginable, figuring out who you are is still the hardest part. The sun hasn't broken the horizon yet, but the sky is beginning to glow, a soft gradient of pale lavender bleeding into the deep blue of the fading night. You can see it through the high, open archways of the villa as you wander back toward the inner garden, that slow Rome sunrise unfurling like a silk sheet over the city. It's the quietest part of the night. This just before dawn moment, when everything feels still and honest, like the party has finally stopped pretending. The wine has mostly run dry, the dancers are asleep, the laughter has curled into silence, and now all that's left is what remains once the desire has burned off. The decisions, the regrets, the truths no one wanted to say out loud. You find yourself by a table, long since cleared of its courses, now cluttered with used goblets, sticky fruit rinds, and a pair of sandals that clearly belong to someone much more confident than you. You touch the surface absently, fingers sliding over a spill of dried honey. Your mouth tastes like raisins and regret. Your head is buzzing, but it's not the wine anymore. It's the weight of everything you've seen, and you've seen a lot. The whispered deals, the performed pleasure, the careful cruelty. You've seen people become bolder, freer, kinder, stranger. You've also seen how deeply loneliness can dig itself into a room full of naked bodies. But the one thing you haven't stopped seeing, no matter how many faces you try to forget, is the way alcohol was poured into every empty space, like that it was the answer to every unspoken question. Because the wine, of course, flowed like water. And that wasn't by accident. Let's talk about that. Romans drank, not occasionally, not moderately. They drank because wine was embedded into the structure of daily life, religiously, socially, economically. It was more than a drink, it was a symbol, a necessity, and at events like this, it was the key to everything. The host's status was measured not only by how rare their vintage was, but by how long they could keep it flowing. Cutting off the wine too early? Social suicide. Letting it go too long? Dangerous. Here's your historical fact. Roman wine wasn't drunk straight. It was always mixed with water, sometimes seawater, sometimes honey, sometimes herbs, and almost always according to rigid dilution ratios that everyone pretended to follow and then immediately ignored. Drunkenness was frowned upon in theory but accepted in practice, as long as you didn't embarrass yourself too early. The commissatio, or drinking party, often followed the feast where guests engaged in controlled excess. The idea was to stagger towards surrender, not trip into it head first. And here's your fringe fact. The Romans believed that different wine types had different temperaments. Falernian, the strongest, was said to make men bold but reckless. Kecuban was supposed to bring out the sentimental side. There was even a superstition that certain vineyards grew better if fertilized with ashes of executed criminals, because nothing says earthy finish like a little state-sponsored execution mulch. You're thinking about all this as you watch a man nearby retch quietly into a potted fig tree. He's wearing one sandal and an expression of deep personal betrayal. A servant waits nearby with a cloth, not judgmental, just resigned. It's clearly not the first time this has happened, probably not even the first time tonight. Elsewhere, a woman giggles, then cries, then giggles again, her eyes rimmed with smudged coal. Her friend holds her hand gently, murmuring something too low to hear. A goblet falls and doesn't break. A pair of drunken lovers try to find their clothes but end up sharing a robe and stumbling toward the exit together, laughing like children. And through all of it, the wine keeps being poured. Someone hands you a cup. You hesitate, then take it. You sip, and it tastes different now, less like indulgence, more like habit. Your body doesn't crave it, but your hands have learnt the motion. It's almost muscle memory. Tilt, drink, sigh. And maybe that's the real danger here. You begin to understand how a place like this eats people alive, not in dramatic, gladiator arena fashion, but slowly, sweetly, like a fruit left too long on the vine. It spoils with pleasure, and the wine is the spoon that feeds you just enough to forget it's happening. You catch sight of Petronia again, seated on a raised platform, one leg tucked beneath her, a cup of untouched wine in her lap. She's no longer smiling. Her eyes are fixed on nothing, like she's trying to remember a name or erase a memory. Around her, the villa buzzes with the last flickers of decadence, but she seems outside of it now, distant. Watching the end of her own play, you realise she hasn't had a drop all night. Not really. Sipped here, toasted there, but never indulged, never slipped. She's orchestrated the entire thing stone sous. That's when you really get it. The wine was for you, for the guests, for the ones being softened and loosened, and manipulated gently but expertly into revealing who they are and what they want. Petronia watched it happen, like a surgeon watches blood rise, precise, patient, predictable. You wonder how many secrets she's learned tonight, how many alliances she's strengthened or broken with just a well-timed refill. Here's the scholarly debate. Was wine in Rome purely recreational, or was it a tool of control? Some argue that communal drinking created real camaraderie, that it allowed citizens to bond, confess, connect. Others suggest it was more Machiavellian, that those who controlled the flow of wine also controlled the conversation, the tone, the intimacy, that parties like this were designed to disarm and extract. You're starting to believe the second group. The goblet in your hand suddenly feels heavy. You set it down. Behind you, a guest tries to stand and fails. Another slaps his back and makes a joke, but the laughter feels tired now, like an echo of itself. The night has overstayed its welcome. Everything that was going to happen has happened. The rest is just inertia. You take one last walk through the atrium, the triclinium, the garden, retracing your steps through a battlefield of empty plates and secrets. You pass two guests asleep in each other's arms, faces slack with vulnerability. You pass a servant wrapping a guest in a cloak. You pass a statue of Bacchus with a grape stuffed into his mouth. And for the first time, it doesn't seem funny. Just tired. The wine has done its job. Now comes the cost. The final hour before dawn always feels unreal, like a glitch in time. The stars are fading, but the sun hasn't made a proper entrance yet, and the entire world seems caught between breaths. In the villa, it's quieter than it's been all night. The servants are starting to clean more openly now, their movements no longer disguised in the background. They move with practiced speed and silence, sweeping away the evidence of pleasure, dragging cushions back into neat rows, gathering goblets and sandals and hairpins like they're collecting sins. The guests who remain are mostly watching them, some with vague guilt, some with open indifference, and a few with the hollow look of people who don't know where else to go. You sit again on one of the long couches in the atrium, this time upright, your posture more purposeful. The wine has worn off, the fog lifting. What's left in its place is a weird clarity, the kind you only get after being awake far too long. With no distractions left to dull your senses, everything seems sharper. The oil stain on the floor, the wilted flowers in the centerpiece, the faint crack in the marble column no one's bothered to repair. Then comes a new sound, music. Not the sensuous winding melodies from earlier, but something lighter, brighter. A man with a lyre, he's older, dressed in a robe that's clearly seen better decades, sits cross-legged in the garden and plucks out a tune that's almost cheerful. It cuts through the fading erotic haze like a breeze through incense smoke. And then, from behind him, another man joins in, reciting lines, not poetry this time, but jokes. Filthy ones. You're not sure whether to laugh or cringe. The jokes are crude, rhythmic, clearly rehearsed. Something between stand-up comedy and satirical poetry. A few nearby guests chuckle. One covers her face, trying not to laugh too loudly. Another just groans and mutters, "Not again." Apparently this guy's a regular. But here's the twist. Underneath the dirty punchlines and exaggerated delivery, the jokes are sharp, political. There's a dig at the governor's mistress, a barb aimed at a senator's generous interpretation of chastity, even a mocking line about the temple priest's suspicious new renovations, and no one stops him, because this, oddly enough, is tradition. Let's dive into that. In ancient Rome, satire wasn't just entertainment, it was cultural commentary, in fact. The Romans invented satire as a literary genre. Poets like Juvenal and Horace didn't just roast bad poetry or bad breath. They tackled corruption, vanity, social climbing and hypocrisy with surgical precision. These performances, especially at private gatherings, were a form of release. A way for the elite to mock themselves and each other without consequence, assuming they knew when to laugh and when to shut up. Historical fact: during certain banquets, the host would intentionally hire performers who specialised in obscene poetry and sharp-edged jokes. These entertainers, often slaves or freedmen, had more freedom of speech than many citizens, precisely because they were seen as harmless jesters. Of course, that protection only went so far. Say the wrong thing to the wrong person, and you'd find yourself whipped, sold, or worse. But if you were clever, you could say just about anything, as long as it was wrapped in rhyme and humour. And here's your quirky detail. The Romans loved riddles and puns involving body parts, especially ones that doubled as sexual innuendos. One common favourite involved a game where guests tried to describe a sexual act without using any direct terms. The more elaborate and poetic the metaphor, the louder the applause. Think of it as dirty Mad Libs, but in Latin, and probably shouted by someone wearing only a garland and a half-draped tunic. You realise, watching this performance, that the laughter feels different from earlier in the night. It's not seductive anymore. It's communal. It's the release after the intensity, the kind of laughter people need after they've felt too much, done too much, said too little. And it's not just the jokes. Some of the lines are flat, others recycled, but the relief in the room. A kind of shared agreement that the night is over, and no one wants to talk about what they did, so they laugh instead. Clytemnestra sits down beside you again. How she keeps finding you, you'll never know, and rests her head on your shoulder without a word. She smells like rosewater and ash. Her makeup is smudged, her voice hoarse. You don't speak, you just listen together as the lyre player shifts into a gentler tune. Petronia does this every time, she murmurs eventually. Ends it on a laugh. Smart, you say. She thinks it resets the room, clears the guilt. Does it? Clytemnestra shrugs. For some. The sun is almost up now. Light creeps into the courtyard, faint but sure. The statues begin to look less sensual and more ridiculous. Bacchus with grapes in his hair. Venus caught mid-seduction. Mercury stepping on a turtle for no clear reason. In daylight, the drama fades. Everything becomes just a little too much, too theatrical, like the props of a play no one remembers auditioning for. You sip water and feel it chill your tongue. You haven't eaten in hours, but you're not hungry. Your body is still processing whatever it was that happened here. It wasn't just sex, it wasn't just politics. It was something in between: intimacy as performance, vulnerability as currency, control dressed up as surrender. Which brings us to the scholarly debate. Were these events authentic expressions of desire, or just performances? Some argue that everything in elite Roman life was a performance. Your rank, your home, your marriage, even your grief. So why not your pleasure? Others suggest that the very theatricality of these parties created space for authenticity, that in pretending people sometimes stumbled into truth. You're inclined to agree with both, because here, in this rambling moment between night and day, with makeup smudged and jokes echoing through the colonnades, people look more honest than they did at any point during the peak of the night. Not because they confessed anything, but because they stopped pretending, even for a second. You exhale, not dramatically, just finally. The party is ending. Not with fireworks or a scandal, but with a song and a joke, and the quiet sound of sandals returning to marble. The sky is now pale gold, streaked with the last hints of twilight, and the villa seems to sigh along with it. Light spills into every space that was dark just hours before, under couches, between pillars, across the floors where lovers once rolled like waves against the tide of silk and oil. It's a strange kind of exposure. Nothing's really changed, and yet it feels like everything's been peeled back. The candlelight has fled, the spell has broken, all that's left now are bodies, tired, tangled, a little sticky, and the morning after hush that settles over Roman decadence like a heavy judgmental blanket. People are leaving in 2s and 3s. You watch them collect themselves with practiced ease, retying sashes, rinsing hands in basins, applying fresh perfume to cover the scent of the night. No one speaks much now or more. The gossip will come later in different villas, whispered between bites of honey cake and sideways glances, but in this moment there's only the quiet choreography of retreat, like everyone agreed to step off stage at once, and you somehow are still here. You wander back into the main hall, where servants are gently, politely reminding the last few guests that the sun is rising. A woman in gold sandals is hunched over a tray of olives, trying to decide whether it's worth eating one. A man with smudged eyeliner is humming to himself, possibly still drunk, possibly no longer in this century. Near the entrance, a pair of older men are arguing quietly about something, their voices sharp with fatigue and irritation. Something about who was supposed to bring the wine offering to the temple this morning. They both smell like vinegar and guilt. And then you see her. Petronia. Not draped in goddess silk this time, not surrounded by admirers. She's standing barefoot in the garden, hair loose, robe half-tied, watching the sun rise over her own courtyard like it belongs to someone else. She's alone, and for the first time she looks tired. You make your way toward her without thinking. Her eyes flick toward you, but she doesn't speak. Beautiful view, you say, because small talk feels safer than honesty. It was, she replies, eyes still fixed on the horizon. You throw a good party. That earns a faint smile. I throw the necessary kind. What does that mean? It means no one comes here for the figs. You both fall quiet. This is the part they never write about in the scrolls, the hangover of power. The raw, unfiltered aftermath of being the centre of the room, and then standing in it alone once everyone's left. Petronia's robe is stained at the hem. Her eyes are rimmed with coals she didn't bother to remove. Her feet are dirty from walking barefoot through her own garden all night. But none of it diminishes her. If anything, she looks more powerful like this. More real. More dangerous. And here's your historical fact. For elite Roman women, hosting was a form of soft power. In a society where women were often legally restricted from holding office or voting, they learned to wield influence in subtler, more devastating ways. Through their salons, their connections, their bedrooms, and yes, their banquets. A woman like Petronia could decide the fate of marriages, careers, even political alliances, just by choosing who sat beside whom, who got invited and who didn't. The most famous example? Clodia Metelli, sister of the infamous Publius Clodius Pulcher and lover, and destroyer of many. She wielded her charm like a dagger. Her house was the unofficial headquarters of whispered schemes, late-night deals, and poet-driven propaganda. She didn't need a title. She had influence, and in Rome that was often more potent than power. You wonder now what Petronia gained from this night, what favour she secured, what loyalty she bought, what enemy she's planning to bury with a single line of well-placed gossip. You suddenly remember that the man who whispered in your ear earlier, the one with the too perfect smile, never came back, and Petronia hasn't asked about him. Which brings us to a fringe fact. In some elite Roman circles, throwing a convivium wasn't just a social act, it was a political manoeuvre. The guest list alone could signal allegiance, rebellion, or ambition. Some historians argue that during periods of tension, the Senate watched parties more closely than actual legislation. After all, Rome didn't run on laws, it ran on relationships. You turn to Petronia and ask the question you've been chewing on for hours. Do you ever just throw a party for fun? She gives you a long look, not annoyed, not condescending, just tired. No, she says finally, but I used to pretend that's why I did it. That lands like a brick in your chest. She steps past you, trailing sandalwood and fatigue, and calls for water. A servant appears instantly, as if summoned by thought alone. The cup is placed in her hand before the words even leave her mouth. She drinks slowly, like it's something sacred. That's when you realise how many layers a party like this has. On the surface, sex, music, wine, laughter. Beneath that, strategy, performance, masks, motives. And at the very bottom, loneliness, deep iron-weighted loneliness that clings to the bone. Not just Petronia's, everyone's. Here's the scholarly debate, and it's a good one. Were Roman elite parties expressions of community, or just distractions from isolation? Some argue that these gatherings were the glue that held aristocratic culture together, shared rituals, shared space, shared experience. Others see them as proof of just how fractured the upper classes were, how desperate they were to connect, and how rarely they succeeded. You look around and see both. There's a couple embracing near the fountain, not kissing, not fondling, just holding each other, like they're both afraid of the day. There's a man slipping out quietly, glancing back only once. There's a servant gently brushing petals from a statue's base, humming to herself like the whole thing never happened. And there's you, still in the same robe, still half-oiled, half-exhausted, wondering what you've become part of, wondering if you'll ever see these people again, wondering how long you'll carry this night with you, and what it will turn into in memory. Scandal, romance, regret, or maybe something stranger. A mirror you didn't expect to look into, a question you didn't know how to ask, an answer you're still not sure you want. The sun is fully up now, the city is waking, somewhere a temple bell rings, and the last of the party disappears into the light. You step outside the villa just as the city of Rome exhales into morning. The light hits your eyes like a slap. It's too pure, too honest, too unlike everything you just left behind. The marble steps are cool beneath your feet, and the street beyond the gate is already stirring to life. Market stalls creak open. A man with a donkey cart curses loudly at a runaway chicken. You smell bread baking, horse sweat, olive oil, human waste. The real world, ugly, ordinary, grounding. After the sensory blur of Petronia's villa, it feels like being dunked in cold water. You take a few steps down the path, your sandals squelching slightly, still damp from something spilled in the courtyard. You look back once, the villa looms like a memory, its tall, vine-covered walls now blank and neutral in the sunlight. If you hadn't been inside, you'd never guess what happened there. The laughter, the skin, the sighs, it's all been sealed back inside the marble. You could walk past it every day and think it was just another aristocrat's estate. And maybe it is, but now you know better. You've seen what lives inside, and soon others will start talking, because now comes the fallout. Gossip in Rome is a beast with many heads. It slinks through porticos, glides between bathhouse steam, curls itself into temple prayers, and slithers out of a senator's wife's lips just as she dips her fingers into a bowl of garum. A single night, especially one like Petronia's, can fuel weeks, even months of whispered suspicion. Who was seen kissing whom? Who slipped away into the guest wing with a foreign envoy? Whose son fell asleep in another man's lap? And more importantly, who's pretending it didn't happen? This is where the real tension lives. Not in the moaning or the laughter or the wine-drenched confessions, but in what comes after. In the carefully edited stories told the next day. In the silences that suddenly form between people who used to nod at each other in the forum. In the subtle punishments, social exclusion, awkward pauses, invitations that suddenly stop arriving. You walk through the narrow streets of the Aventine Hill, slowly descending towards the Tiber. Your robe is still loose, and you realise you've left a ring behind. Maybe on purpose, maybe not. You tuck your arms tighter around yourself. People pass you, bakers, slaves, early risers heading to the temple steps, and no one gives you a second glance. No one knows where you've been. You're just another bleary-eyed Roman stumbling home from somewhere they probably shouldn't have been. Let's talk about reputation. The Roman concept of dignitas wasn't just about public standing, it was about the image you cast across the collective consciousness of the city. It was your moral weight, your social shadow. To lose it wasn't just embarrassing, it could end your career, your marriage, even your life. The higher you rose, the easier it was to fall. Historical fact: Julius Caesar divorced his wife Pompeia not because he believed she was unfaithful, but because of what people might say about her involvement in a sacred women's festival where a scandal erupted. His reasoning? Caesar's wife must be above suspicion. Reputation wasn't just everything, it was the only thing. And here's your quirky fringe fact. Roman rumour mills were so intense that actual written text circulated filled with satire, slander, and invented scandals. Like ancient burn books. Invectives, they were called. A blend of poetry, prose, and vicious mockery that sometimes destroyed lives more efficiently than swords. If you weren't careful, you could find yourself immortalised as a punchline in some amateur poet's sex elegy. That's the Roman version of going viral. And it came with consequences. Back on the street, you start to remember fragments of the night that you thought you'd forgotten. Not the obvious stuff, the kisses, the oil, the flute song, but the glances. The half-finished sentences, the deals made in corners, the servant who watched you a second too long, the moment when Petronia caught your eye and knew something about you before you even knew it yourself. You wonder how much of it people will talk about, how much they'll lament, how much they'll forget on purpose. And here comes the scholarly debate. Were Roman sex parties really about sex? Or were they about control, creating a space where people drop their guard just long enough to be watched, measured, recorded? Some scholars argue that these parties functioned like informal courts of power. Others say they were escapism, nothing more. Pressure valves for a society obsessed with order and status. But those aren't mutually exclusive because a control and escape often wear the same outfit. Sometimes silk, sometimes gold, sometimes nothing at all. A cart rattles by, splashing a muddy puddle across your ankles. You don't even flinch. You think about the man who held your chin and said nothing. About Clytemnestra's laugh echoing through the courtyard. About the servant girl who looked through you like she could see the next day already. You wonder if you'll go back. If the next invitation comes, will you pretend to hesitate? Will you tell yourself it'll be different? That you're not that kind of person? Because that's the real trick of these parties. They don't end when you leave, they crawl under your skin. They linger in the quiet moments. They visit you when you touch someone's hand and remember how it felt to be touched, without asking why. They change you, not all at once, but slowly, subtly, until one day you find yourself throwing a party of your own, and wondering who'll remember you after the wine runs out. The sun finally breaks through the city's skyline, casting gold across the rooftops, turning terracotta tiles into a sea of fire. You squint, squinting more from what you now know than from the light itself. A child runs past chasing a dog. A man hawks bread from a cart. Life continues, oblivious. But you're no longer just a guest. You're part of the story now, and you know how these stories spread. By the time the sun is high enough to erase the last of the shadows, you've made your way back to your own neighbourhood. It's quieter here, simpler. No perfumed slaves lounging at doorways, no courtyards shaped like temples. Just worn brick, crooked shutters, and the earthy smell of people living regular lives. Your feet ache, your head pulses softly, and your robe clings to you in places that feel indecent in the clarity of daylight. A baker nods at you from his stall like he's seen your walk of shame shuffle before, and he probably has. You consider nodding back, but choose anonymity. It's easier. You pass a group of young men, apprentices by the look of them, joking loudly as they carry bundles of dyed wool. One of them says something crude in your direction, a bark of laughter that rings too sharp in your ears. You don't respond, but you feel your face harden without your permission. You're not in Petronia's villa anymore. Here, every gesture means something different. A glance doesn't mean invitation. A smirk isn't flirtation. Here, your status hangs on how convincingly you pretend nothing ever happened. And that's when the rumours start reaching you. You hear the first one before you've even turned onto your street. Two women chatting beneath a fig tree, exchanging gossip with the casual expertise of professional spies. You hear snippets, and apparently she left with both of them, followed by knowing laughter. You don't need to ask who she is, you just keep walking. At the bathhouse it gets worse. The men in the tepidarium are already talking about it. Petronia's party. No one says sex party, of course, that would be vulgar. They say gathering, convivium, night of cultural indulgence. But the smirks give it away. They speak in code. The wine flowed too freely. Some of our dear colleagues forgot their wives existed. Someone was seen touching someone they should only discuss in the Senate. They haven't noticed you yet. You linger behind the steam listening. And then, just as you begin to turn to leave, you hear a name. Yours. It's said casually, like seasoning on a well-roasted cut of meat. No venom, no excitement, just included. As if your presence at Petronia's party has become common knowledge. As if your body, your choices, your face, now catalogued and catalogue-worthy, are part of Rome's morning digest. You feel your stomach touch drop. It's not that you didn't expect this, it's that you didn't expect it to be so easy. You, who had done nothing more scandalous than drink too much and kiss someone with a poetic jawline, are now part of someone else's anecdote. A story they'll twist and exaggerate and pass around like fruit in a communal bowl. Let's talk about scandal. In Rome, scandal is currency, and that brings us to tonight's featured trio. Nero, Caligula and Messalina, the Hall of Famers of Roman debauchery. Nero, who turned orgies into stage productions and allegedly married a man dressed as a bride while wearing a veil himself. Caligula, who made horse-shaped power moves and was rumoured to have turned the palace into a brothel. Messalina, wife of Emperor Claudius, who was said to sneak out at night and compete with prostitutes for who could entertain the most men before dawn. Were the stories true? Maybe, probably not all of them. Roman historians had axes to grind, and sensationalism sold scrolls. But the fact that people believe these stories tells you everything. They didn't need truth. They needed spectacle. And nothing was more compelling than a powerful figure letting their robe slip just far enough to reveal a moral failing. Bonus points if that failing had thighs. Quirky fact, in ancient Roman graffiti, especially in places like Pompeii, you'll find names, real ones, etched alongside crude drawings and short messages. Marcus did it here. Lucia likes it loud. I screwed a slave here. It's not just bathroom humour, it's proof. Proof that Romans loved naming names. Loved turning real people into entertainment. And now you are entertainment. You return home, wash your face, strip off your robe. You stare at your reflection in the water basin. You look normal. Tired. A little smudged. Nothing about your appearance screams immoral participant in elite pleasure cult, but that won't matter. Once your name is out there, your body isn't yours anymore. It belongs to the story, and everyone tells it differently. Some will say you were bold, that you held your own, that you were touched by someone important. Others will say you were pathetic, that you drank too much, that you followed someone out of the room and never came back the same. You think of Clytemnestra, of her laugh, her warmth, her whispered truths in your ear. You wonder what story they'll tell about her, if they'll even remember her name. You lie back on your sleeping mat and stare at the ceiling beams. Outside, carts rattle, a dog barks, a fishmonger sings badly. Life, undeterred, carries on, and yet everything feels off. Because here's the thing about Roman parties. They never stay in the villa. They chase you home, they slip into your name like a rumour-wearing stolen perfume. And once they settle in, they grow roots. You might leave with your clothes, you might even leave with your dignity, but you never leave with your anonymity. Here's your scholarly debate for the morning after. How much damage could these parties actually do to a reputation? Some argue that Roman society was too hardened, too used to scandal, to care, that if everyone's misbehaving, no one's really at risk. Others insist that these events were career-ending if you slipped up, especially for women, lower-class citizens, or those without powerful allies. The margins for error weren't equal, they never are. You don't know yet which camp you fall into. Maybe this will all blow over. Maybe your name will be replaced by someone more scandalous next week. Maybe Petronia will host again, and your face will fade from memory like old wine on marble. Or maybe this is the beginning of something else, not disgrace, but transformation. Because once you've been seen, really seen in a room like that, nothing fits quite the same anymore. Not your robe, not your routine, not your reputation. A week passes, maybe more. You're not sure anymore because time, like everything else, feels just a little warped now, distorted by memory, by whispers, by the soft echo of wine-soaked footsteps trailing behind you. The morning after, Petronia's party came and went, and then came the next morning, and the one after that. You return to your usual habits, the public baths, the fruit market, the temple steps, where people toss prayers at indifferent gods and hope someone's listening. You walk the same streets, past the same faces, and yet somehow everything feels observed, as if your life has picked up an audience. And it has. The stories are spreading. You hear them in the most unlikely places. At the fishmonger's stall, someone mentioning a senator seen stumbling home with lipstick on both cheeks. In the bathhouse again, one man claims to have personally witnessed a tryst between a general and his house poet. At a bakery, two women debate whether a certain matron was invited to the party or merely tolerated. The tone is always the same. Part disgust, part envy, all tinged with the pleasure of having something juicy to dissect over olives and stale bread. And then again your name, not shouted, just slipped into conversation like it's always been there. Someone calls you Petronia's new favourite. Someone else wonders aloud what you did to earn such an invitation. And the worst part, you don't correct them. You could. You could say you were barely noticed, that you drank more than you meant to, that your big scandal was reclining too close to someone with a senator's last name and not enough self-control. But the lie they're building for you is more interesting than the truth, so you let it grow, and the longer you stay silent, the more powerful it becomes. Let's talk about infamia, Rome's unofficial method of social execution. It wasn't always a legal sentence, though it could lead to one. It was more like a stain, a mark made not by judges, but by murmurs. Once someone acquired infamia, they weren't necessarily punished by law, but their name lost its shine, invitations stopped coming, credit dried up, allies distanced themselves like rats from a sinking ship. And here's your historical fact. In 18 BCE, Augustus passed the Lex Julia de Adulterius, a sweeping law intended to moralize Roman society. Among other things, it criminalized adultery, particularly for women, and made it punishable by exile or execution. Men could be punished too, especially if the scandal was public, but let's be honest. The law was designed to control behaviour, not protect feelings. Petronia's parties lived on the edge of that law. Carefully constructed, plausibly deniable. Nothing technically illegal. No public brothel, no coin exchange, just a gathering. Just wine, just art, just a little too much oil. You think about this every time someone looks at you a little too long, every time someone doesn't look at you at all. You thought it would be fun, being the centre of a story. But it's not. It's a trap. A frame you didn't build but now have to live inside. Even if the rumours are flattering, there's still ownership. People feel entitled to your story now, to your body, in absentia. They talk about you like you're not there, and sometimes, just to see what it feels like, you pretend you aren't. One afternoon you spot a familiar face outside the forum. The senator who smiled at you during the poetry reading, his eyes hazy with expensive wine and other people's secrets. He sees you. His lips twitch. But instead of nodding, instead of acknowledging the shared night, he looks away. Too many witnesses, too much sunlight. And you? You feel invisible again. But not in the way you used to, because now people remember you on purpose when it's convenient to forget. Which brings us to Messalina. Valeria Messalina, wife of Emperor Claudius, has become a kind of cautionary tale in Roman society, and people can't stop talking about her, even years after her death. According to the sources, who were, let's be real, probably a mix of biased and bloodthirsty, she lived a double life, empress by day, mistress of chaos by night. She allegedly married another man in secret while still married to the emperor, an act of hubris so outrageous it led to her execution. But the line between myth and truth has blurred over time. Some scholars argue that Messalina was framed, set up by political enemies, demonized to justify her removal. Others believe she really did orchestrate midnight orgies and power plays beneath the imperial sheets. Either way, she represents a terrifying idea, that a woman, when powerful and unafraid of her own desire, becomes dangerous. That's what you feel now, that quiet pressure, the slow-growing suspicion. You're not just rumoured to be interesting anymore. You're rumoured to be strategic, calculating, a threat. And whether it's true or not doesn't matter. In Rome, perception is reality. Here's your quirky fact for the day. Roman senators were forbidden by law from entering certain types of taverns and entertainment venues considered too low for their status. But did that stop them? Not even close. They wore disguises, slipped in through back entrances, bribed doormen. The higher the rank, the greater the hunger for risk. Hypocrisy was baked into the system like raisins in bad bread. You remember that now when someone smiles at you too sweetly. When a wealthy merchant suddenly asks if you're attending Petronia's next gathering. When a woman you've never met offers you honeyed dates and pretends it's just hospitality. They all want in. And they think you have the key. Clytemnestra reappears a few days later. You find her leaning against a column in the public garden like she's been waiting there since the Republic fell. She looks different. Same smirk, same sparkle, but something else behind her eyes. Less mischief. More warning. "They're watching you," she says, skipping any form of greeting. "I know." "Good. That means you're not stupid." You sit beside her, and for a moment it's like nothing ever changed. But of course it has. You're not just two party guests reminiscing over a shared night of scented oil and poorly played harp music. You're survivors of a party, of a game, of a system. "They'll want something from you now," she says. "They'll either try to seduce it out of you or shame you into giving it away." "And what do I do?" She shrugs. "Decide what story you want them to tell. And that, more than anything, sticks with you, because you can't escape the narrative anymore. But you might still have a chance to shape it. There's a moment a few days later when you realise the party is truly over, not just the physical one in Petronia's villa, but the one that's been echoing in your mind ever since. You're standing in line at the public fountain, an amphora balanced against your hip, the sun already beating down in that indifferent Roman way. The woman in front of you is arguing about water pressure. A child behind you is chewing on a fig like it's a punishment. It's a perfectly ordinary moment, quiet, dull, and yet you feel it, this internal click, like a door finally shutting. No one's looking at you anymore, not in that way, not with curiosity, not with mischief, not even with judgment. The buzz has shifted, a new scandal has bloomed, something involving a foreign ambassador and a very underage musician. People are whispering about that now, your old news. Your name has slipped into the background noise of the city, where rumours go to settle like dust on forgotten statues. And yet you feel it, the after. It's still with you, not loud, not overwhelming, just present, like a stone in your sandal that you don't bother removing anymore. The night changed you, and now the world is acting like it never happened. There's a kind of violence in that. Not dramatic, not obvious, just quiet, constant erasure. And that, strangely enough, is the worst part. You didn't ask to be seen, but now that you've been seen, being unseen feels unbearable. You make your way home through alleys that feel smaller than they used to. You pass men playing dice in the shade of a crumbling wall, their laughter sharp and childish. You hear one of them joke about the kind of party where clothes are optional and morals go missing. You don't react. You keep walking, but you note it. Another echo, another piece of that night surviving in someone else's mouth. Let's talk about the aftermath, because Rome was built not just on marble and blood, but on what came after. Every public spectacle, every scandal, every whispered betrayal. It was all followed by the real reckoning. In Senate meetings, in marriage negotiations, in carefully worded letters and family dinners, where eye contact meant more than speech. The morning after mattered more than the night itself. That was when the lines were redrawn. Historical fact, following the notorious Bacchanalia scandal in 186 BCE, the Roman Senate didn't just outlaw the cult's rites, they rewrote the rulebook. They issued a decree that limited the number of people who could gather for certain types of religious or social events without explicit approval. It was less about stopping the behaviour and more about stopping the loss of control. Rome didn't fear a sex. Rome feared what people did when they felt free. And here's your fringe fact. Some Romans believed that after a night of excess, one should visit a temple, not to confess, but to re-anchor themselves. The idea was that indulgence needed to be followed by grounding, that a party, no matter how pleasurable, disturbed the natural order, and order had to be restored. So they'd bring offerings, wine, garlands, prayers, and pretend the gods hadn't already been watching. You find yourself doing something similar. You don't plan it exactly, but your feet carry you to a small shrine tucked behind a bakery, barely bigger than a pantry. It's dedicated to Libitina, the goddess of death and funerals. Not exactly the post-party energy you were aiming for, but there's something fitting about it. You light a small taper, whisper a nothing prayer, and leave a fig on the altar. You don't know what you're asking for, or who you're asking, but it feels better than doing nothing. There's a girl sweeping the steps nearby, barefoot, hair tied back with twine. She nods at you, not warmly, not coldly, just with acknowledgement. The kind of nod that says, yeah, I've seen things too, and maybe that's all you needed. You walk home lighter, but not clean. You're beginning to understand that the after isn't about guilt, it's about residue. You carry the smell of the party long after you've bathed. You see the faces even when you close your eyes. You remember the way someone laughed as they broke their own boundary, and how someone else cried after. You remember the look on Petronia's face, perfect composure, cracking just for a second, and you wonder what it cost her to host a night like that. Because it always costs something. Here's the scholarly debate. Did Roman elites actually believe these nights were harmless? Some argue yes, that they saw pleasure as a kind of divine gift, necessary counterweight to civic duty. Others argue that they knew exactly what they were doing, that every cup of wine was a calculated risk, that every pairing, every whisper, every step into that garden was a move in a long game of politics and survival. You now suspect the truth is somewhere in the middle, because the worst scandals in Rome weren't about sex, they were about intention. Did you mean to seduce the senator's daughter? Did you mean to pass on what you heard in the atrium? Did you mean to be seen? That's what people are always trying to prove or deny. That it was an accident, that they were drunk, that they didn't realise the door was open. Because if you meant it, then it's not just a story, it's a challenge. And Rome does not tolerate challenges. You spend the next few days quieter than usual. You say less at the baths. You nod more, you listen. You become a shadow of yourself. Not hiding, just reassembling. Because you're not the same anymore. You're not bolder, not wiser, but you're aware. You've stepped into the machinery of Roman society, not just as a cog, but as a curiosity. People have seen you stripped of politeness, soaked in pleasure, caught between choices, and now they're waiting to see what you become next, and maybe you are too. You wake one morning, still wrapped in a thin linen sheet, and there's this odd silence in your chest, like your thoughts are paused, holding their breath. It's not fear, not exactly, just a strange awareness that something has shifted again. You lie there, eyes fixed on the wooden ceiling, and for the first time in days you don't replay the party. You don't recall the soft flute or the way someone moaned near the mosaic fountain, or the way Petronia's voice rang like polished brass through the torchlight. Instead, your mind turns to the edges of it. The pauses, the no's that weren't quite loud enough, the interpretations that weren't asked for, the things no one dared name, because beneath all the velvet and wine there were lines, invisible to some, unspoken by most, and crossed by more people than anyone wants to admit. Rome prides itself on indulgence, but it fears the mirror. And now that you've stepped behind the curtain, you can't help but ask, what wasn't allowed at Petronia's party? What was too much, even for Rome? You spend the morning pacing, you sweep your floor though it's already clean. You wash your hands twice, there's an itch you can't reach, a discomfort that won't fade. Something's crawling under your skin, a realization you didn't want. That maybe it wasn't the wine or the sex or the performance that left you feeling raw. Maybe it was watching how close people got to a boundary, and how easily some laughed while crossing it. Let's talk about taboos. For all its reputation as a civilization of orgies and decadence, Rome had limits, real ones, cultural, legal, moral, depending on whom you asked. Certain acts were simply not done, at least not publicly, not without consequence. And when they were, Rome responded not with outrage, but with correction. Historical fact, incest, though rumoured often, was legally and religiously condemned. The Emperor Claudius caught heavy criticism for marrying his niece Agrippina, even though the Senate had to change the law just to make it technically legal. And while stories swirled around Caligula's behaviour with his sisters, they weren't celebrated. They were used to justify his assassination. Scandal was tolerated until it became inconvenient. Then there were the lines around violence, sexual violence especially. For slaves, the concept of consent was nearly non-existent. They were property. But for citizens, especially freeborn Roman men or women of status, there were expectations, there were boundaries. A violation of those wasn't just a moral crime, it was a status insult, and that couldn't be ignored. You think now about the way some guests at the party didn't touch, didn't speak, didn't move, not out of shyness, tibia, but out of frozen fear. You remember the boy with wide eyes serving wine whose hand trembled when someone tugged him too close. You remember the woman who laughed too loudly after being kissed, like she needed witnesses. You remember how quickly certain moments were brushed aside, buried under the next round of harp music or another body pressing in. Rome could turn its head like no other culture in history, but sometimes it snapped back with teeth. Here's your fringe fact. Certain mystery cults in Rome, notably the early Bacchic rites, were shut down not for being erotic or religious, but because they involved practices that crossed into what the Senate deemed un-Roman. Initiation rituals that included psychological coercion, emotional manipulation, and possibly sexual domination were considered threats, not to the gods, but to the order of society. The idea wasn't to protect morality, it was to protect control. And that's what you start to realise. These parties, these indulgences, these whispered invitations, they weren't lawless. They were highly curated, crafted, with boundaries, with watchers. There were unspoken rules about who could be touched and who couldn't, who was allowed to cry and who would be laughed at for it, who was allowed to say no and who would be ignored if they did. Here's the scholarly debate, and it's a messy one. Did the Romans understand consent in the way we do today? Some scholars argue yes, at least in elite circles. They point to laws against rape, to poems lamenting unreciprocated desire, to plays that show the consequences of forcing a lover. Others argue that the Roman framework was too steeped in hierarchy, status, class, gender, to allow for a concept like mutual consent. If you had more power, you had more rights, full stop. You find yourself somewhere in the middle, because what you saw that night wasn't outright violence, but it wasn't freedom either, it was structure. And within that structure, people were allowed to take what they wanted, as long as they knew where the lines were. And who couldn't say no? You pass by a young couple in the forum, a man and a woman arguing in hushed tones. The man grabs her wrist. Not hard, but fast. She pulls back. Her face flashes with embarrassment. He doesn't apologise, he just walks off, muttering. She smooths her hair, regains her composure, and leaves in the other direction. No one else even notices, and suddenly you remember something Clytemnestra said somewhere near the end of the party when the music had slowed and everyone was lying around like melting wax. She had leaned over, drunk on her own sharpness, and whispered, "The trick is knowing when you're being hunted." At the time, you'd laughed. You thought she was being dramatic. Now it doesn't feel like a joke, because Rome is full of hunters. Some wear togas, some wear perfume. Some smile as they feed you grapes, and some host parties, and sometimes the prey doesn't know it's prey until it's walking home barefoot in the morning, wondering why it feels like something was taken that can't be named. You walk slower these days, not with fear, but with caution. You watch how people look at each other, who speaks and who stays silent. You're learning the map, the terrain beneath the pleasure, the rules no one writes down because indulgence is allowed. But crossing the wrong line, that's when the city remembers its teeth. It's late afternoon when you find yourself seated beneath a faded fresco in the corner of a tavern you've never been to before. Not your usual spot, not the kind of place where respectable citizens hover. It smells like watered-down vinegar, sweat and fried fish, and yet there's something comforting about it. Anonymous, gritty, real. The kind of place where no one cares what happened at Petronia's villa. Or pretends not to. You stir your drink absently, cheap wine with a sprig of something that might have once been mint, and watch the other patrons. They are not the silk-draped types. These are rough men in tunics, tradespeople, off-duty guards, gamblers nursing bruises and egos. You think you spot a senator's bodyguard at the back table, though his cloak is turned inside out and he's slouching like he doesn't want to be recognised. Even the powerful need somewhere to disappear. It's here, surrounded by cracked pottery and worn stone that you hear it again, the laughter. That particular tone, not joy, not amusement, but satire, snobbery in disguise. It comes from the table next to yours, where two men and a woman are deep into a bottle and louder than they should be. They're quoting poetry, juvenile, you think, or maybe martial. Dirty verses, biting lines about banquet goers, limp men with inflated pride, aristocrats caught mid-depravity. One line makes the whole tavern snicker. He dined with gold on his chest and shame in his lap. They howl with laughter, and one of them, you swear, glances at you. Not directly, just long enough to make your stomach tighten. Satire in Rome is never just poetry, it's a weapon. Let's talk about that. Romans didn't just create satire, they perfected it, turned it into a mirror polished sharp enough to cut. In the hands of poets like Juvenal, satire wasn't just commentary, it was dissection. A way to expose hypocrisy, indulgence, decadence. A way to mock without naming names, but with just enough detail that everyone knew who was being dragged. Historical fact, satire was protected under the claim of artistic expression, but it wasn't without danger. Poets could, and sometimes did, end up exiled or assassinated. Lucan found himself on the wrong side of Nero's favour and paid the ultimate price. But others survived by dancing just close enough to the line, mocking society while staying useful to it. Because Rome loved satire, until it pointed at the wrong person. And here's your quirky fringe fact. Roman street performances often included actors mimicking public figures. Exaggerated walks, fake accents, obscene gestures. These mime shows were crude, hilarious, and highly illegal if you mocked the wrong man. Still, they happened. Because the appetite for gossip in Rome was as endless as its aqueducts. Now the debate, was satire simply entertainment or a form of resistance? Some scholars argue that Roman satire helped reinforce social norms. It mocked the people who deviated, reminded the public of the right way to behave. Others see it as a subversive tool, a way for the powerless or the clever to push back against authority without drawing a sword. You suspect it was both, because here you are, seated quietly while three strangers turn your night, your choices, your image, into someone else's punchline. And they never say your name. They don't have to. All it takes is a phrase. Petronia's latest acquisition? Laughter again. Did you hear about the flute? Even louder. It could be coincidence. It probably isn't. You sip your drink slowly. It tastes like someone else's spit. And here's the strange part. You don't feel angry. Not exactly. You feel studied. As if someone took your body and turned it into a metaphor. A lesson. A warning. A joke. That's what satire does. It flattens people into symbols. You're no longer a person who made choices. You're a shape in a story someone else controls. You leave before they can say anything else. You don't slam your cup down. You don't make a scene. You just slip into the street and blend with the crowd like a shadow looking for cover. Because now you understand what comes after scandal, after the whispers, after the awkward glances, mockery. It's the final stage of Roman social digestion. They admire you, then they desire you, then they fear you, and finally, they laugh at you. And if they can't, they pretend to. Because laughter is power. It reclaims control. It pushes people back into their boxes. You walk past a butcher's stall, the smell of meat thick in your throat, and you suddenly remember a story Petronia told near the end of the party, after the guests were scattered across cushions like exhausted gods, half asleep and fully exposed. She'd said, "They'll always try to make a joke out of you. The trick is learning how to laugh louder." At the time, you'd thought she was being poetic. Now it sounds like advice. You turn down a quiet street, your shadow long in the amber light. You pass graffiti on the wall, a crude drawing of a man kissing a donkey. Beneath it, Lucius was here, and he couldn't last a minute. It's childish. It's brutal. It's immortal. Someone centuries from now might read it and laugh. Not because they know Lucius, but because they know that feeling. Of being seen and stripped of dignity. Of being turned into entertainment. You wonder how long your name will stay in the air. A week? A month? Long enough for another story to take your place? You consider writing something yourself. Your own poem, your own verse. Not to defend yourself, but to seize control. To frame the night on your terms, to remind Rome that behind every joke there's a person. Behind every scandal, a body. Behind every smile, a strategy. But instead, you keep walking, because sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do in Rome isn't shout. It's wait. Wait until they think you're forgotten, and then show them how well you remember. You don't expect to be invited to anything for a while. Not after the whispers, not after the tavern, not after your name fluttered through the city like a parchment caught in a windstorm. But then, almost 2 weeks after Petronia's night, a folded wax tablet arrives. No pretense, no riddles, no perfume, just a name scratched in firm, impatient strokes and a location you don't recognise. The edge of the Esquilin Hill near the old aqueducts. The host isn't Petronia, it's someone else, someone new. And the invitation ends with a phrase that feels more like a dare than an offer. Initiates only, dress light. You stare at it for a while, then fold it back and tuck it away. You shouldn't go. You know you shouldn't go, so naturally you do. The place is quiet when you arrive, barely marked. An unassuming doorway beneath a garden wall covered in ivy and centuries of dirt. A servant ushers you inside without a word, guiding you through a narrow corridor that smells like moss and damp stone. Before opening into something far larger than you expected, circular chamber, candle-lit, low-ceilinged, filled with a half-dozen others sitting on cushions speaking in hushed voices. The walls are painted, but not with the usual mythological scenes. These are darker, stranger. Vines and torches, open mouths, eyes without faces. A bull standing on its hind legs, draped in garlands. You've stepped into something older than Petronia's games, something less interested in beauty, more interested in truth, or what passes for it in the shadows. You sit, no one greets you, no one introduces themselves, someone offers you a cup. You take it without asking what's inside. It tastes like cloves and metal. Welcome to the world of the mystery cults. Let's pause for some history. While most Romans participated in state religion, sacrifices to Jupiter, prayers to Mars, the usual pantheon, many also belonged to secretive, semi-underground religious groups known as mystery cults. These weren't blasphemous per se, but they were suspicious. You couldn't just walk in off the street. You had to be initiated, and once you were, you didn't talk about it. Not publicly, not even with other members sometimes. The mystery was part of the power. Historical fact, among the most famous of these cults were the Eleusinian mysteries dedicated to Demeter and Persephone, the cult of Isis, imported from Egypt, and of course the Bacchic rites honouring Bacchus or Dionysus. Depending on your cultural preference, these weren't just religious experiences, they were transformational. Designed to break you and rebuild you into someone who belonged. And the Bacchic ones? They were legendary. Here's your fringe fact. Before the Senate cracked down on the Bacchanalia in 186 BCE, the cult had grown to such scale that it spanned classes and genders, including slaves, women and foreigners, an alarming level of access to ecstasy and equality from the Senate's perspective. They feared it not just for the orgies or the drinking, but for the power it gave to people outside of the usual hierarchy. And that's what you're feeling now. This gathering doesn't have the theatrical elegance of Petronia's party. There's no gold, no poetry, no dancing, just eyes. Watching, not judging, just witnessing. You're being seen again, but in a different way. Not as an ornament, not as a story, but as a body among other bodies, stripped of status, held in a kind of spiritual tension. There's a woman leading this thing. Tall, pale, with hair that falls like wet ink across her shoulders. She doesn't smile. She doesn't flirt. She pours the drink, makes the signs, says the words. Tonight we loosen the rope, she says, and it's not metaphorical. She leads you through a series of chants, some Latin, some Greek, some in a language you can't place through a... You repeat them because everyone else does. The room begins to move, not physically, but in rhythm. Breaths sink. Heartbeats seem to align. And slowly the idea of who you were when you walked in starts to drift. You're not drunk, you're not high, but you're tilted, your mind slipping sideways, your thoughts blooming like ink in water. Someone reaches for your hand, you let them, not out of submission, not out of politeness, out of curiosity. Because here's what separates this night from Petronia's. No one's performing, there are no games, no dare or drink, no senator watching from behind a curtain. No poet scribbling verses about your thighs, just this shared permission, this mutual undoing. Someone whispers something into your neck, you don't turn to see who. It's a compliment or a prayer, or both. And you start to understand these cults weren't about rebellion. Not really. They were about release from expectation, from hierarchy, from the rigid rules of Roman life where every word, every gesture, every pleasure had a place, and consequences. In here, there are no consequences. Only transformation. Here's the scholarly debate. Were these cults truly liberating, or just alternate systems of control? Some argue that they were escapism dressed up as revelation. Places where the illusion of freedom was sold in cups of wine and cryptic chants. Others insist they were sacred sanctuaries for people crushed by Roman order, freeing something deeper than the Senate ever could. The truth probably depends on who you were when you joined, and who you became after. You? You're still not sure. But as the ceremony deepens, as bodies begin to lean into one another, as the chanting gives way to soft touch and silent exploration, you feel a strange kind of peace. Not because this is better than what happened at Petronia's, but because it's different, less curated, less ornamental, less Roman, more human. You don't know who touches your shoulder next, you don't care. You lean in, and you loosen the rope. The morning after the mystery gathering feels unlike any other. Your body doesn't ache the way it did after Petronia's party. There's no guilt crusted onto your skin, no perfume clinging to your hair like an accusation. You wake slowly, eyes blinking against the soft grey light, filtering through the open window. And for once, your first thought isn't what did I do, it's what did I learn? And that right there tells you everything. You sit up, stretch, and notice the faint purple mark on your wrist. Someone's fingers had held you there for a moment, firmly but without force, like you were an anchor or maybe a lantern. You touch the spot gently, not to check for pain, but just to remember. It's strange how even small moments of connection can echo long after the room has emptied. No one from the gathering asked for names. There were no titles, no family lines traced, no need for stories. You don't know what the others do, who they serve, whom they sleep with, or what political corners they whisper in. And that anonymity, it wasn't emptiness, it was freedom. Freedom from the usual Roman obsession with status, with bloodlines, with reputation dripping from every gesture like sweat from the brow of an overworked statue. You head toward the bathhouse around midday, not for gossip this time, not to eavesdrop or gather fragments of your own name, but just to wash. Your body feels tired in the way a field does after rain. Quiet, rinsed, waiting. You soak in the warm pool and think of the chants, the way the woman's voice rose not to command but to guide. She didn't orchestrate pleasure the way Petronia did, she invited it. And there's a difference. Let's talk about Rome's relationship with the sacred and the sensual. For all its indulgence, Roman society kept strict lines between public worship and private desire. The gods, after all, didn't care who you kissed, as long as you left the proper offering. But mystery cults blurred that line. They brought the divine into the body, into the act itself. Sex wasn't just tolerated in those rituals. It was sacred, an offering, a communion, a shedding of the false self. Historical fact: in the cult of Isis, originally from Egypt but wildly popular in Rome, ritual cleansing, ecstatic prayer and occasional sexual rites were meant to bring worshippers closer to divine understanding. The body wasn't seen as a dirty vessel, but as a bridge between earth and godhood. Participation in these ceremonies was believed to grant not just spiritual insight, but a kind of transformation, a rebirth. And isn't that what you felt last night? But Rome, being Rome, didn't quite know what to do with these rituals. Sometimes it embraced them, especially when emperors needed the public distracted. Other times it cracked down hard. The cult of Bacchus, for example, was considered such a threat to order and decency that it was violently suppressed, temples destroyed, worshippers arrested or worse, not because the rites were erotic, but because they were free. And here's your fringe fact. One of the lesser-known sects involved in ecstatic worship supposedly used snake venom diluted in wine to create visions. They'd bite their own lips during the chant and claim to speak with the gods. Whether it worked or just knocked people out cold is up for debate. But it's the kind of story Rome would whisper about while pretending it wasn't intrigued. You step out of the bath and wrap yourself in a towel, catching sight of yourself in the polished bronze mirror. Your face looks softer, not younger, not happier, just less defensive. Like you've stopped holding something in your jaw for the first time in weeks. Later that day, you visit the market for fresh bread, and something peculiar happens. A man stops you, a grain merchant you vaguely recognise, older. Eyes like burnt almonds. He doesn't flirt. He doesn't smirk. He simply says, "I heard you went east of the aqueduct." It's not a question. You nod slowly. He nods back. "Good," he says. "More people should." And then he walks off, leaving you with a sack of flour and a raised eyebrow. So it's some is known, quietly. Not in the same way Petronia's party spread like perfume across the gossiping elite. This is different. A rumour, yes, but one whispered more like a code, as if being part of that gathering marked you not for scandal, but for insight. Like you've joined another map of Rome entirely, one that runs beneath the marble and arches and clean-cut colonnades. That night, you light a single oil lamp and sit near your window. The sky is velvet, and the stars blink like they're watching you now, not judging, just waiting. And here's the scholarly debate. Were these cults genuinely spiritual, or just another form of elite distraction? Some historians argue that for women, foreigners, slaves, those often excluded from traditional Roman religion, these gatherings were lifelines. Others argue that they were just sanctified orgies with better costumes. But you've now lived both kinds of night, the one for power, and the one for presence. You don't have all the answers, you're not a philosopher, but you felt the difference. Petronia's party showed you what people do when they think everyone is watching. The mystery gathering showed you what happens when no one is. You sit with that thought for a while, roll it around in your mind like a marble on stone, then you write something down, just a single line, not a poem, not a prayer, just this. When no one owns your stirrups, it stops being currency. You don't know what it means yet, not fully, but it feels like a beginning. The oil lamp flickers, and for once, you sleep without armour. By now, you've become something else entirely, not a scandal, not a curiosity, but a question mark. People don't whisper your name so much as they pause when you enter a room. You see it in the slight tilts of heads, in the way voices trail off mid-sentence. No one knows what to make of you anymore, and that suits you just fine. Because mystery is power. And in Rome, power has many faces, but the most dangerous ones are the quietest. You don't rush. You don't chase invitations. You simply exist. And that somehow is more unsettling to people than any gossip. You're no longer dancing to anyone else's rhythm. No senator's house, no patron's expectations. You're the ripple now, not the stone. It all becomes clear during a dinner at a merchant's villa. A gathering you didn't intend to attend but were roped into after an afternoon errand and a badly timed compliment. You arrive late, dressed simply, unbothered. The room is already thick with incense and boastful laughter. The kind of crowd that leans just left of the aristocracy, new money, minor poets, successful whores turned matrons. No one quite noble, no one quite not. You take a place near the edge of the triclinium, where the light is soft and no one's too interested in seating arrangements. The host is a man with too many rings and not enough wit. He tries to impress you with a story about his cousin's affair with a Vestal virgin. Utter nonsense, but delivered with such conviction that the table titters politely. And then, predictably, the talk turns to those parties. "You know," says a woman in a coral-dyed tunic, "I've heard they're doing things now that would make Caligula blush." Her tone is teasing, but her eyes are hunting. They slide toward you as if daring you to respond. You don't, but someone else does. "Maybe Caligula needed to blush," says a voice across the table. It's a younger man. You don't know him, but his smile is sharp, his hands clean. Or maybe the stories just got bigger because the truth wasn't enough. The table quiets a little. Not completely, just enough to notice the shift. The coral tunic woman raises her cup slowly. "So you're defending orgies now?" He shrugs. "I'm defending truth, or at least the idea that people should know the difference between a scandal and a sacred experience." And there it is again, that thread, that quiet acknowledgement of something beyond the surface, of what you saw beneath the draped silks and giggling masks, the way the body can be more than pleasure, the way pleasure can be more than escape. Let's take a breath and dip into the archives. Historical fact, Caligula, Rome's favourite madman, was likely the victim of extreme exaggeration. While some reports say he named his horse as consul and committed every crime imaginable, many modern historians believe those tales were politically motivated, crafted after his assassination to justify it. A dead emperor makes an excellent scapegoat, especially one who defied the Senate, favoured popular entertainment over formal ceremony, and dabbled too openly in divine imagery. It's not that he didn't do strange things, it's that Rome needed him to seem monstrous afterward. To draw a line. "See, we killed the monster, we're moral again." Fringe fact, a preserved wall in Pompeii includes graffiti listing names and prices from a local brothel, alongside political slogans praising specific candidates. This wasn't accidental. The brothel and the ballot were neighbours. Pleasure and power in Rome were never far apart. Back at the table, conversation picks back up like a dog shaking off rain. But now there's tension. A subtle recalibration of who's safe and who's unpredictable. The young man with the sharp smile doesn't speak again, but you catch his glance, just once, and he nods. Not in recognition, in alignment. After dinner, as the guests drift toward the garden, the host tries to corner you with a joke about honey and fig syrup and how they used to sweeten the flesh. You sidestep him with a smile and a vague compliment about his marble floor. It's always the floor with men like him. They love to be praised for what they can step on. Outside, the air is cool and citrus-scented. You wander alone between trimmed hedges, eyes following a moth as it flits between lanterns. You're not thinking of the gathering beneath the aqueducts, or even Petronia's villa. You're thinking about how people talk about what they don't understand, the way they laugh first. Always laugh. As if humour can flatten anything uncomfortable. Sex, ritual, desire, fear, it's all easier if it's funny. Here's the scholarly debate. Did Roman laughter about sex indicate acceptance or repression? Some argue that Roman society was open and celebratory about the erotic, that jokes and poems were a sign of liberation. Others claim the laughter was nervous, a performance designed to keep taboo topics at arm's length. After all, if you're laughing, no one asks why you're looking so closely. You light a small taper from a garden flame and hold it up to a marble bust perched along the wall. It's a woman, face serene, one breast exposed in that effortlessly staged Roman way. Someone has scratched a tiny heart onto the pedestal with the word beneath. Just that, beneath. What lies beneath. You think about that all the way home. Because Rome's greatest illusion is that the surface is all there is. That the marble tells the full story, that silk is a sign of virtue. That pleasure is shame, that power is loud. But you've seen what lives in the cracks. You've heard the chants beneath the aqueduct. You've kissed someone whose name you'll never know under the eyes of painted gods. And now you understand you don't need to explain yourself. You are the question. Let them wonder. You're back on the Palatine Hill when Petronia finds you again. Not in a bathhouse or a dinner hall, not behind some velvet-draped threshold or hidden among half-naked bodies lounging on silk cushions. No, she finds you walking, alone. Just another Roman silhouette against a hazy sky framed by crumbling arches and dust. She doesn't call your name, doesn't announce herself like someone trying to be remembered. She simply falls into step beside you, as if she's been there all along. For a while you walk together in silence. Her perfume is lighter now, something green, like cypress. Her hair's pulled back in a braid that feels functional instead of flirtatious. And when she finally speaks, it isn't with her usual smoky grandeur. No poetry, no teasing, just 5 words. So, you found the others. You don't ask what she means, you know. She's talking about the gathering near the aqueduct. The night of chants and ritual and bodies moving not for display but for meaning. The night you were seen, not as a character in someone's story but as a living pulse in the dark that you nod. That's all she needs. I never told you about them, she says. Didn't think you were ready. You glance at her, eyebrows raised. And now I am? She shrugs. You walk toward it without an invitation. That's the only test that matters. There it is again. The idea that initiation isn't granted, it's chosen. That transformation isn't handed to you at a party with the red wine and velvet couches. It's something you reach for in the dark, not knowing what you'll touch. You stop near a garden wall, the city sprawling out below like a broken mosaic. Tiny people. Tiny problems. A sea of roofs and ambition. Petronia watches you. They're afraid of you now, you know. You blink. Who? Everyone who saw you and thought they understood you. Everyone who used your name like a garnish on their gossip platter. Everyone who thought you'd be a pretty moment and nothing more. She says it like it's obvious. Like it's the natural progression of things. You want to argue. To tell her you're no one. That you just attended things. That you never orchestrated, never wielded power. Never so much as hosted a dinner for more than 4. But then you remember that's exactly the mistake everyone makes. Assuming power has to be loud, has to be formal, and Petronia, she knows better. Let's rewind a bit. Historical fact. Some of the most powerful women in Rome were never given official titles. They weren't empresses or priestesses or centaurs' wives. They were hostesses, patrons, whisperers. Think Fulvia, who took up arms after her husband's death and controlled entire legions through her political manoeuvring. Or Clodia, literary muse, social puppet master, and possibly poisoner. They operated not through decrees, but through dinners, through gossip, through control of the atmosphere around the powerful. And here's your fringe fact. Roman women, especially of elite status, were forbidden from voting. But that didn't stop them from buying influence in elections. They funded campaigns, arranged strategic marriages, and spread propaganda through poems and plays written by the lovers they kept fed and flattered. Influence wasn't official, it was oxygen. Petronia leans against the wall now, sunlight cutting her face in half. You remember Lucius Plautus? She asks. You nod. You remember. Too much wine, too few boundaries. A poet's mouth and a merchant's ethics. He's fled to Sicily, she says. Word is he's avoiding charges, something about forged inheritances. But people are saying it started with what he did at my party, that the senator's nephew saw too much, that your name came up. You stiffen. I didn't... She raises a hand. I know you didn't say anything. That's not what matters. What matters is that now people think you could. And there it is, the truth you've been skirting for weeks. Your presence is no longer just decorative, it's dangerous. Not because you've done anything, but because people believe you might. And in Rome, belief shapes reality more than marble ever could. Scholarly debate time. Were elite Roman parties genuinely safe spaces to speak, to scheme, to seduce? Or were they social traps, curated arenas where every move was observed and stored away like blackmail wax sealed in memory? Some scholars argue these events were performative safety, freedom on a leash. Others insist they were more honest than the Senate floor itself. After all, people under the influence of pleasure are rarely capable of lying well. You glance at Petronia, who's watching a hawk circle overhead, maybe thinking about flight, maybe about prey. So now what, you ask? She smiles, faint and tired. Now you decide what you want to be, your past surviving, your past being talked about. The next move is yours. You don't answer, not right away, because you're still thinking about how this all started, with a single invitation, with a curiosity, with the willingness to let yourself be watched. And now here you are, being feared, or at least cautiously respected. People think you know too much. They think you've seen something sacred and haven't told you. And the more you keep quiet, the more dangerous you become. You wonder what happens when you speak. Petronia leaves before you can ask her anything else. No farewell. Just a look that says, you'll figure it out, and maybe you will. That evening you walk the streets not with caution, but with presence. Heads turn again, but this time the looks are different. Less amused, more calculating. You pass a senator's aide who lowers his eyes. You pass a merchant who straightens his tunic. You pass a woman you once overheard laughing about you, who now whispers something to her companion and walks the other way. It's not glamour, it's not scandal, it's something sharper. You don't speak, you don't perform, you just walk, and Rome watches. Because maybe the most revolutionary thing you can do in this city is to own your story and then not tell it. Let them guess, let them fumble, let them wonder what you know, whom you touched, what you saw. Because that kind of power, it doesn't fade with the hangover. It grows. You wake the next morning before dawn, stirred not by a sound or a dream, but by a stillness so complete it feels almost sacred. The sky outside your window is ink blue, the city hushed in that narrow, holy gap between the last watch of the night and the first clatter of the market carts. It's a moment you never used to notice. But now you lie there in silence, wide awake, and you feel Rome breathing, like it's waiting, or listening, and for once it feels like it's listening to you. You rise without ceremony, wrap yourself in a robe that still smells faintly of last week's incense, and step out into the street barefoot. You don't need to know where you're going, your feet take you there. Past shuttered homes, past temples wrapped in sleeping ivy, past bakeries just starting to stir. There's no one to perform for now, no curious glances, just the soft rhythm of your soles against stone. You reach the edge of the Aventine Hill as the sun begins its slow climb over the rooftops. Gold spills across the Tiber like honey, poured too thick, and for a moment the whole city looks like it's been cast in amber, suspended, preserved, beautiful and brittle. And standing there in that golden hush, you remember everything. You remember your first night at Petronia's, how you walked in half nervous, half curious, not knowing whether you were a guest or a prop. You remember the heat, the music, the eyes, the moment someone touched your shoulder without asking and you let them. The way your name passed from mouth to mouth like wine-stained gossip. The morning after, when you weren't sure who you were anymore, and you remember what came next, the shift, the stares, the stories, the silence, the second invitation, the chant, the hands that found you in the dark, not to consume you but to connect. That night by the aqueducts changed something. It untied a knot in your chest that had been there so long you forgot it wasn't part of your anatomy. Rome still doesn't know what to do with you, but it no longer gets to decide who you are. You walk back through the forum as it awakens, and the city begins to hum with all its usual noise. Vendors shouting, sandals slapping, philosophers arguing about things no one's paid them for in decades. And yet the rhythm of it no longer overwhelms you. It feels like background music, like texture, like the pulse of something you've finally joined instead of stood outside watching. Let's pause here, because this is where most stories end. The return, the reflection, the calm, and yes, it is a kind of ending, but it's also something else. A recognition that you are not who you were. That the version of yourself who walked into that first party has long since melted away, like wax near the flame. Historical fact. In Roman tradition, a rite of passage wasn't just about the moment. It was about what came after. Boys shaved their beards and donned togas, yes, but it was the new responsibilities, the shift in how they were addressed that truly marked the transformation. Similarly, a soldier wasn't a veteran until he returned home, not when he survived, not when he fought, but when he re-entered, changed. You've re-entered now, but you're not a child of Rome anymore, you're a part of it. Quirky fringe fact, some Romans believed the soul could be reshaped through ritual pleasure, that ecstasy wasn't about escape, but about realignment. There were recorded ceremonies where participants claimed to leave their bodies entirely, returning afterward with new purpose, new clarity, even new names. Whether or not it was true doesn't matter. What matters is that they believed transformation through desire was sacred, not shameful. You pass by a group of young men reciting poetry beneath a columned walkway. One stumbles over a line. They laugh. You pause just long enough to catch the verse. She dared to drink from the same cup as the gods, and found her tongue tasted divine. They don't notice you. You don't need them to. Later, back home, you sit down to write. Not for an audience, not for posterity, but for yourself. It's not a confession. It's not a list of names. It's a kind of map. A tracing of what happened and how it felt. Or you write about silk and oil and laughter. You write about when a whisper changed your spine, when a gaze unthreaded your defences, when you tasted power and decided not to spit it out. You don't name Petronia. You don't need to. You write one name, yours, not the one Rome uses when it gossips, the one only you know. Because here's the final scholarly debate. Did Roman pleasure culture elevate or erase individuality? Some argue it was all performance, everyone playing roles, hiding behind masks, acting out social scripts in lavish settings. But others say that within those performances, in the pauses between rehearsed moans and curated toasts, people found themselves. In a world that tried to define you by lineage, rank, virtue, maybe losing yourself for one night was the only way to reclaim who you really were. And you think the truth is this. Rome will never stop watching, but you've stopped needing its approval. You've been a scandal. You've been a secret. You've been a question. Now, you're a choice. You blow out the lamp, the last of the wax hissing into silence, and climb into bed. The windows open. The air smells like fig trees and coming rain. The city murmurs to itself in the dark. And for the first time since this all began, you don't feel like you need to listen. You are the murmur now. You drift to sleep not with wine on your lips or laughter in your ears, but with one clear thought. You survived. And more than that, you were seen, on your terms. So here we are, at the edge of it. The candles are long melted down, the silk sheets cooled, and the last flute note has floated into the night. What began as curiosity, an invitation whispered behind a fan, a tilt of the head at the wrong kind of dinner, became something else. Not just spectacle, not just candle. A journey. And you made it. Barefoot across marble floors, blindfolded beneath moonlight, naked in more ways than the obvious. It turns out the real story wasn't what happened behind Petronia's closed doors or even beneath the aqueducts where chants echoed like memory. The real story was what it did to you. How Rome peeled you back layer by layer, until the version of you that once cared what people whispered became irrelevant. You learnt the difference between performance and presence, between being wanted and being witnessed, between pleasure as currency and pleasure as clarity. Rome will keep spinning its stories. Another name will rise tomorrow. Another party will end with someone staggering home in borrowed dignity. But yours lives in the in-between now, not erased, not explained, just understood. You don't need to prove us anything. You don't even need to speak. Sometimes the most radical thing you can do in a city obsessed with spectacle is simply remain. So if you're still awake, pull the blanket up a little higher. Let the hush of midnight Rome settle around your ribs. You're not the same. You were never meant to be. Close your eyes. Let it all dissolve. Marble, gossip, oil, firelight. Let the last sound be your own breath. Not from exhaustion, but from peace.